Hey everyone, welcome back. Quick thanks to the patrons who keep this channel alive. Your requests are what I narrate next. If you want to join them, you can try Patreon free for 7 days, then it's starting with just $3 a month. Links in the description. Now, let's get into the story.
Azazel. There's no future for you following Shaw. Come with me. 10,000 meters up, Brian made the offer to the dying man he'd just beaten half to death. Azazel? He lifted his head with the last of his strength and looked at Brian. If Brian had possessed Professor X's telepathy at that moment, he would have heard a torrent of hysterical swearing. Who recruits a man by beating him half to death? Besides which, Azazel had his pride. He'd joined the Hellfire Club. He was not about to turn on it that easily. I am Azazel. Of the Hellfire Club. He said it hoarsely, weakly, and without room for argument. Agree to follow me, and I may be able to get Emma to take the psychic imprint out of your head. Watching Azazel glare at him, Brian said it without hurrying. I, Azazel, the Red Devil, am willing to follow you. Mr. Kent. The man who had sworn allegiance to the Hellfire Club a moment earlier changed position without visible difficulty. Set against loyalty to the Hellfire Club, what Azazel wanted was his freedom back. As for how Brian knew about Emma's imprint in the first place. Professor X had told him. Azazel had been under Professor X's control earlier, which is how Professor X found it. A sensible choice. Now. Go back to Shaw, and report his movements to me whenever there are any. Brian patted his shoulder lightly, and dived with him. The reason for recruiting Azazel was simple. Brian wanted to know what Shaw was doing at all times. Azazel's teleportation let him report the Hellfire Club's movements from anywhere, whenever he liked. Without any risk of Shaw noticing. And as for whether Azazel might change his mind again. As far as Brian was concerned, so long as Azazel wanted his freedom, he had no choice but to cooperate. Swish. And as Brian dived toward the shore. Adaptive evolution triggered again. Beneath the white wings, a second pair grew. Brian pulled out of the dive. A smile spread across his face. Adaptive evolution didn't only let him adapt to extreme environments. Given time, it would keep pushing him toward a perfect organism. Brian had now evolved into a four-winged angel form. As long as I stay weightless, I can keep growing wings. Perhaps I'll end up a 1,000-winged angel. Brian allowed himself the thought. He also knew that becoming an ultimate creature like that wasn't the work of a single day or night. But the four-winged angel form alone was enough for Brian to own the sky. Boom. Brian beat all four wings lightly, and his speed went straight past Mach 8. Which is comparable to the most advanced supersonic aircraft in the world. And at that speed, Brian could still pull off any maneuver he wanted. Brian was now faster than Azazel's teleportation. Almost in a blink, he was hanging in the air directly above Shaw. Brian dropped Azazel without ceremony, and came down slowly himself. As his feet touched the ground, the four wings regressed behind him and vanished. Buzz. And as they went, his body shuddered. Then he felt, sharply, an inscription of a four-winged angel surface on his skin, and sink down into his genes. Seeing through the operating laws of all things let Brian understand what it was immediately. In evolution, organisms undergo directional selection. What suits the environment is kept. What doesn't is discarded. Brian's adaptive evolution works the same way. It selects the forms best suited to the environment, preserves them, and stores them in the body. Four-winged angel form is obviously better suited to high altitude than angel form. So adaptive evolution recorded it. And because it had been recorded, the next time Brian found himself at high altitude it would no longer be a matter of random evolution. He could choose to activate the four-winged angel form his ability had selected. Or he could let it evolve at random as before. Brian smiled. His adaptive evolution had finally given him something he could trigger at will. There was only one inscription so far. But Brian believed that in time his body would accumulate a whole range of them. And adaptive evolution would become an ability he controlled outright, letting him take whatever form he wanted, whenever he wanted. Brian, what exactly is your ability? Shaw looked across at him with real curiosity and asked it. My ability is survival of the fittest. I can adapt to any extreme environment, and my body evolves to match. Brian told him without hiding a thing. Shaw was taken aback. He had asked more or less idly. It had not occurred to him that Brian would actually answer. Survival of the fittest, adapting to extreme environments and evolving? Brian, your ability has no equal. Shaw looked at him in astonishment. Exactly like Professor X had. The moment he heard what survival of the fittest was, Shaw understood what it could become. Brian, come to me. Join the Hellfire Club. I can help you develop that ability. I can make you a god. Shaw looked at him with burning eyes and made the offer again. I could become a god. Brian appeared to waver. Yes, Brian. My brother. An ability like yours can make you a godlike being. You could be the Messiah of mutant kind. The Savior. I could even make you the Black King of the Hellfire Club. Everything the club has would serve you and you alone. Excitement put a tremor into Shaw's voice. Hearing the terms Shaw was offering. Bloody hell, Brian thought. He was, briefly, genuinely tempted. But there it was. Brian's goal, besides using Professor X to find other mutants, was to take Shaw's mutant ability. So however good the terms, he was never going to accept. Shaw. Your terms are extremely tempting. I'd like to accept. But you should never have killed my own kind. My family. The people I loved. I want Darwin avenged. Brian looked at him with hatred and said it low. Brian, I honestly don't know when I killed this Darwin. Perhaps you've made a mistake. Even now, Shaw could not recall killing a black mutant by that name. Oh, don't insult me. I watched you kill my brother with my own eyes. There's no mistake. Brian clenched his fists, furious. Then it seems we can only be enemies. Looking at him, Shaw's face darkened. In that case, Brian, I'll have to kill you. The cold came into Shaw's eyes. He opened his right hand, and a sphere of red energy formed in his palm. Brian. Let's find out whether you can adapt to this. Shaw sneered, and threw the sphere. It was the energy Shaw had absorbed a few minutes earlier, when Brian destroyed the yacht with a single punch. On the shore of the port. Brian and Shaw stood facing each other. Brian had turned down Shaw's offer. So Shaw had thrown an energy bomb straight into him. Boom. A deafening explosion. Shaw's energy bomb was the shockwave and blast energy he'd absorbed when the yacht went up. The bomb didn't look like much. Palm-sized, no more. But there was a great deal packed into it. The ground under Brian's feet caved in beneath the enormous shockwave. And Brian, at the center of it, was swallowed by the fire. Shaw watched the middle of the blast, waiting to see whether Brian could adapt to an energy bomb. And a low, entirely unbothered voice came out of it. Shaw. Do you really think you can kill me? Brian walked out of the flames. By now he had evolved into Silver Surfer form. His whole body was silver-white metal, throwing back a hard metallic shine in the firelight. The heat did nothing but bring a faint red glow to the surface. The shockwave had no effect on his body at all. The kinetic force alone was enough to push his right foot back a single step. Brian's skin in Silver Surfer form is as strong as titanium alloy. Probably stronger. It shrugs off an energy detonation, and it doesn't care about high temperatures. And Silver Surfer form is light as well as strong. His body weight dropped to 1/10 of normal, which made him quick and extremely agile. Whoosh! Brian put a little force into his legs and covered 100 meters in 5 seconds. Arriving in front of Shaw, he drove his right fist straight into him. Bang! Shaw didn't dodge and didn't block. He let the punch land on his face. And every scrap of kinetic energy in it went straight into him. Brian's punch did no damage whatsoever. "Brian. I'm invincible." Shaw said it with complete confidence. Then he raised his own right hand, made a fist exactly as Brian had, and hit him. Loaded with the kinetic energy he'd just taken, Shaw's punch was fast and brutal. Bang! Brian was knocked a clear 2 meters, came down hard, and threw up a cloud of dust. Out of the dust, Brian kipped up onto his feet and brushed himself off as if nothing had happened. All dust and no damage. Silver Surfer form can take a great deal of punishment. Shaw's energy attack was barely a tickle. Boom! Brian had only just got up when Shaw threw another bomb, stronger than the first. Violent orange-red energy struck him. At the instant of contact, Brian's metal body evolved into blue-black stone. His height shot up to 2.5 meters. His weight went to 350 kilograms. He looked like a heavy, lumbering stone man. Shaw's orange-red energy hit him and not only failed to do any damage, it didn't so much as rock him. Brian stood there absolutely immovable. Under Shaw's astonished eyes, Brian walked straight through the bombardment in long strides. And then brought down a fist the size of a cooking pot. "Brian, don't waste your energy." Shaw raised his right hand to catch the fist, and absorbed everything in it as he did. "You can't do a thing to me." Having taken the kinetic energy out of the punch, Shaw said it calmly. Then he raised a hand and struck Brian across the body. Boom! An enormous release of energy went up as a small mushroom cloud. This time what Shaw put out was equivalent to a medium-range missile. "Keep going. Don't stop on my account." Brian's voice came out of the center of the explosion. His body had evolved into something different again. He had returned to his normal appearance. And a circular golden force field surrounded him, making him wholly immune to the blast. "So this time you've adapted an energy shield?" Shaw frowned slightly, and looking at the glittering field around Brian, he was suddenly overcome by a sense of futility. However he attacked, Brian evolved a new form to answer it. The more dangerous it got, the stronger Brian became. The first 2 evolutions had only been changes to his body structure. The third time, Brian had evolved an entirely new mutant ability. Shaw could not begin to imagine what Brian would evolve into if he kept attacking. Possibly something completely immune to his energy. Shaw looked at him, out of options. And his fear of Brian peaked in that moment. An enemy who evolves without limit and is very nearly unkillable. How could Shaw not be afraid of that? "Stop, Brian. You can't kill me. I can't kill you. This fight is meaningless. We're wasting each other's time." Shaw looked at him and said it, defeated. Brian shrugged, entirely unbothered. He'd never expected to beat Shaw. The fight had only ever been about putting pressure on him. The goal was met, so Brian had no interest in wasting further time. And it wasn't only Shaw who felt stuck. Brian felt the same. Shaw's energy absorption is genuinely broken as an ability. Every attack only makes him stronger. It's physical immunity and an energy buff running at the same time. "Emma. We're going." Watching Brian stop, Shaw walked over to Azazel, hauled his badly injured body upright without much care, and said it to the White Queen. "All right, Shaw." Emma nodded, then turned back and smiled at Brian. And the Hellfire Club, 3 people now, left. Watching Shaw and the others disappear, Brian smiled. The fight had been something of an anticlimax. But Brian hadn't come away empty-handed. He had just gained another directional selection. Alongside the four-winged angel inscription in his jeans sat a new one, a golden shield. Brian named the ability he'd adapted Energy Shield. For a first engagement with the Hellfire Club, Brian had done extremely well. 2 directional selection abilities adapted. Riptide's mutant ability plundered. And Azazel quietly recruited. Brian was in an excellent mood. He knocked the dust off himself and walked over to Professor X and Raven. Professor X. Is Magneto still alive? Eric's condition isn't good. He needs a hospital as soon as possible. Professor X looked up, saw Brian, and the look he gave him was full of gratitude. Thank you, Brian. Truly. If it weren't for you, Raven and Eric and I would very likely have died at Shaw's hands. Brian waved it off generously. Professor X, don't. Let's get Magneto to a hospital first. New York. Cantel Hospital, Intensive Care. Professor X looked at Magneto, wrapped in so many bandages he resembled a mummy, and the worry was written all over his face. Behind him, Brian and Raven sat on the sofa in the ICU as though none of this concerned them, eating fruit and watching Professor X with something close to contempt. 3 days had gone by since the fight with Shaw. After Shaw left, the 3 of them had taken the gravely wounded Magneto to Cantel, the best hospital in New York, for treatment. And it has to be said that Professor X had spared nothing. He'd spent millions bringing in the finest medical team in America, and he'd sat with Magneto through every stage of it himself. That degree of devotion made Brian and Raven want to gag. After 3 days of treatment, Magneto was finally out of danger and had been moved into the room they were sitting in. Charles. Take a break. Raven couldn't stand watching any longer. She went over, patted his shoulder gently, and said it. It's all right, Raven. I'm not tired. Professor X shook his head. As a psychic, he wouldn't feel mentally worn down if he went 3 days without sleep. Or a month. But his body was still an ordinary man's. 3 days of sitting up had put heavy shadows under his eyes. Charles, you're beyond help. Raven's eye twitched slightly, and she muttered it half to herself. Then she went back to Brian and curled into his arms like a cat. Over those 3 days, Brian and Raven had been inseparable. Both of them had indulged themselves thoroughly. Brian's adaptive evolution meant he could keep going. He never felt tired at all. And Raven's shape-shifting body has remarkable stamina. In the course of it, Raven discovered something else about her body. Every time she shifted into a new shape, her fatigue reset. However exhausted she was, taking a new form left her fresh again. And that wasn't all. Raven found that however badly a form of hers was injured, changing to a new one left her completely whole. Which made the pair of them a great deal less restrained than they might otherwise have been. It took a telepathic message from Professor X to get them back to the hospital. Professor X, why don't you just wake Magneto up? Brian said it lazily, still working through the fruit. Professor X. He looked at Brian, thoroughly confused, with no idea what he meant. You're a psychic. Waking a man out of a coma should be simple enough. Brian's offhand remark landed on Professor X like a hammer. He looked at Brian with open gratitude. Worry clouds the judgment, as they say. Professor X had been so consumed with Magneto's safety that he'd forgotten he was a psychic at all. He didn't hesitate any further. He put his right hand on Magneto's forehead and sent his mind into him. Wake up, Eric. The thought went into Magneto's mind. And his sleeping consciousness began, slowly, to surface. Gravely wounded and unconscious a moment before, Magneto opened his eyes. Cough, Charles. He coughed hard several times. Then, with Professor X's help, he sat up. Where's Shaw? Magneto frowned and looked around, confused, and was startled to find himself in a hospital. As far as he knew, he was still in the middle of the fight. Eric. The fight with Shaw was 3 days ago. Professor X said it, and used his telepathy to pass the last 3 days of memory into Magneto's mind as he did. In an instant Magneto knew everything that had happened after he lost consciousness. Brian. I owe you my life. Only now did Magneto register Brian and Raven. He looked at Brian and said it low. Magneto. You're a mutant, and that makes you a brother. I wasn't going to stand there and watch you die. Brian said it with total seriousness. A brother? It has to be said that the words landed squarely on Magneto. Under Shaw's tutelage, Magneto had gradually taken on the idea of mutant supremacy. To his mind, mutants should stand together and look after one another, the way family does. Wait. What's this, Magneto? He looked at Professor X, puzzled. Professor X shrugged, and explained. Code names. Raven's idea. I'm Professor X. You're Magneto. Raven is Mystique. He sounded resigned about it. Magneto was entirely satisfied with his. He nodded to Raven, then looked at Brian. And Brian? What's his? The question made Professor X and Raven glance at each other. Neither of them had noticed until now that Brian didn't have one. Homelander. My codename is Homelander. With everyone looking at him, Brian put a hand over Raven's mouth before she could speak, and said it perfectly seriously. Homelander. The other three looked at him blankly, wondering why he'd chosen something with no connection whatsoever to his ability. I think Evolution Master sounds better than Homelander. Raven fought her way clear of his hand and got it out. Raven, I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked for mine. I think Homelander is excellent. There's a sense of freedom in it. Ease. Doing whatever you want. Brian glanced at her and said it. Freedom. Doing whatever you want. Brian, where are you getting that from? Raven scratched her head, entirely unable to follow him. How anyone extracted freedom and ease and doing whatever you want out of the word Homelander was beyond her. But Brian had made up his mind. So all she could do was back him quietly. Everyone, 3 cheers for Homelander. Raven grabbed his right hand, delighted, and announced it at volume. Homelander. Professor X and Magneto joined in. And so mutant kind acquired a Homelander. Homelander Brian. All right. Now that Magneto's awake, I think we should found an organization. A mutant organization. Brian let a beat pass, then raised it. A mutant organization. The other 3 looked at each other and nodded. Shaw had the Hellfire Club. They agreed they ought to have something of their own. To stand against it. Good. Since we're all agreed, the next thing to settle is what to call it. Brian had barely finished when Professor X and Magneto spoke at the same moment. The Brotherhood of Mutants. The X-Men. The 2 of them stopped and looked at each other. And both faces were full of derision for the other man's suggestion. Eric. The Brotherhood of Mutants. Every college in the country has a brotherhood. Charles. The X-Men is the single most embarrassing name I've ever heard. What, are you planning to go and fight for justice? 2 men who had been admiring each other as kindred spirits a few days ago were now completely at odds. Neither would give an inch. Brian sat on the sofa in the intensive care unit. He watched Professor X and Magneto argue with each other. The 2 of them had serious differences about what to call the mutant organization they were founding. Magneto held that mutants should be family, brothers and sisters under one roof. So it should be the Brotherhood of Mutants. Professor X held that the organization should stand for justice, defeat the conspiracy of the evil mutant Shaw, and save the world. So it should be the X-Men. Neither could talk the other round. So both of them turned to Brian, wanting him to decide. As for Raven, both of them overlooked her without even thinking about it. After all, Raven was only a level 3, and her ability isn't suited to fighting. Brian was also a level 3, but his ability was simply broken. He'd gone toe-to-toe with Shaw, the only level 5 mutant in the world, and come out even. Both men had seen exactly how strong Brian was. Which is why they placed him on the same footing as themselves. Let's call it the 7. Brian said it with a distinctly wicked edge in his voice. Professor X. Magneto. Both of them were lost, and both immediately regretted asking his opinion. Ahem. I'm joking. Let's go with the X-Men. After all, Magneto, you joined later. Brian shrugged and said it seriously. Fine. You're right, Brian. Magneto didn't like it, but he had no answer to that. The X-Men, then. Professor X smiled and made it final. And so the X-Men were founded. At present the X-Men had 4 members. Professor X, Magneto. Homelander, Brian. Mystique, Raven. They were the first generation of X-Men, and the founding members of the organization. Brian was now one of the X-Men's 4 founders. The X-Men can't be 4 people. Not as a mutant organization. We need to recruit others who think as we do. Together we can stand against Shaw's Hellfire Club. Professor X thought it over and put it to them. Everyone agreed. He was right, an organization can't be 4 people. They needed to bring in other mutants. But neither Professor X nor Magneto had any idea how. In this era, mutants are still extremely rare. Finding others is a needle-in-a-haystack problem. How to locate them was the pressing question. Brian. Can Darwin's prophecy give us any guidance? Professor X was out of ideas, and pinned his hopes on Brian's friend the Prophet. He hoped the prophecy might show them a route. At the question, Brian made a show of closing his eyes and thinking. 5 minutes later he opened them. Hank McCoy. Beast. Brian gave them a name. Darwin told me once that Beast is a genius inventor, one of a kind among mutants. He might be able to solve this for us. Brian filled Professor X and the others in on Beast. And he wasn't wrong about him. Hank really is a genius. Cerebro, which he built, didn't only amplify Professor X's telepathy. It also let him distinguish mutants from ordinary humans without difficulty. And it was Cerebro that let Professor X find Havoc, Banshee, Angel and the rest with such ease. Beast, he's one of us as well. Professor X asked it, curious. Yes, Professor. He's one of us. Brian said it evenly. Where is he now? Magneto asked it bluntly. I don't know. But there's a place that does. Brian shook his head as he said it. Where? Raven asked, curious. CIA headquarters. Brian named it. He genuinely didn't know where Hank was. But he knew Hank had been working in the CIA's Classified Research and Development Division. Find whoever ran that division, and the trail leads to Beast. CIA headquarters. Professor X frowned. To find Beast, we break into CIA headquarters, find the head of the Classified R&D division, and go from there. Brian's comm delivery landed on the room like an artillery shell. Brian. We can't do that. Professor X was the first to object. His principles wouldn't let him agree to it. He believed that mutants having powers didn't entitle them to abuse those powers, or to do damage to society. Breaking into the CIA, as far as Professor X was concerned, would send a shock through the whole of America. That was the last thing he wanted. Where Professor X objected. Magneto was entirely in favor. Break into the CIA. When? Count me in. Magneto didn't consider it a particularly serious matter. As long as it got him to Shaw. Never mind the CIA. Ask him to assassinate the President of the United States and he wouldn't hesitate a second. Amazing. The X-Men have existed for 5 minutes and were breaking into the CIA. Raven was thrilled. She thought it sounded fantastic. Raven, don't encourage this. Professor X frowned at her enthusiasm and said it sharply. He was against it. It cut directly against everything he'd started this for. And then Brian said something that left him no room to refuse. Professor X, don't forget what Shaw is planning. The entire world is on the edge of destruction right now. Keep dithering like this and you want to watch for nuclear warheads coming down out of the sky. Hearing that, Professor X had nothing. Brian was right. If Shaw wasn't stopped, the nuclear crisis could break at any moment. And when it did, the CIA would be vaporized along with everything else. Brian. How do you propose we get into CIA headquarters? A frontal assault? Professor X gave in. In fact, then and later, Professor X always gave in. Professor X, remember Moira? We use her identity to get inside, find the head of the classified R&D division, and you read Beast's location straight out of his head. Brian had worked it out already. Moira? You deleted her memories yourself. Why would she help us? Professor X raised the obvious objection. He had watched Brian do it. Moira. You'll help us, won't you? Brian turned his head and said it to Raven, smiling. Of course, Brian. I'll help you. Raven smiled, and shifted instantly into Moira. Raven, you're going to walk into the CIA as Moira? No. It's far too dangerous. Looking at her wearing Moira's face, Professor X's expression filled with worry. He thought of Raven as his sister, at the deepest level. And he knew perfectly well that shape-shifting gives her no combat capability whatsoever. If she slipped up even once, there would be nothing waiting for her but death. Professor X did not want her taking that risk. But faced with the worry in his eyes, Brian patted his shoulder gently. Professor X, Raven's grown up. She doesn't need your protection anymore. Besides, I'll be going into CIA headquarters with her. With my ability, nobody is going to be able to kill Raven. Brian meant it as reassurance, and it cut Professor X deeply. He looked at Raven for a long moment, then at Brian, and sighed. When are you doing this? Tonight. Virginia. Langley. Night. Every member of the newly formed X-Men was present. Yes, every member. Once the plan to break into CIA headquarters had been made. The gravely injured Magneto had insisted on taking part. As Magneto saw it, this was the X-Men's first operation. And as a member of the X-Men, he had no intention of missing it. Which is why a badly wounded man was standing in the dark at Langley. Brian turned his head and looked at him. Magneto was wrapped in bandages like a mummy. Beneath him sat a wheelchair. The wheelchair hung in the air, held up by his own power. It has to be said that Magneto had earned the name Showman. Half dead as he was, he still had the bearing of one. All right, Brian. It's down to you and Raven from here. Magneto and I will be waiting outside. In the dark, Professor X came over, put a hand on Brian's shoulder, and said it low. If it goes wrong, we come in. From the wheelchair, Magneto put in his part. He'd originally intended to go inside with Brian and Raven. But he could move roughly one finger at present. Going in would only have got in their way. So he'd settled for the next best thing and taken support duty outside. Come on, Raven. Brian nodded, took her hand, and walked out of the darkness toward CIA headquarters. As for why they didn't simply have Professor X take control of the entire building, Brian's view was that Professor X suffered from a serious case of moral fastidiousness. He refused to attack ordinary people. And while Brian had nothing but contempt for that fastidiousness, there was nothing he could do about it. Brian. I'm a little nervous. The dim street was silent. Only the headquarters ahead of them was lit up. The closer they got, the faster Raven's heart went, and the less control she had over the nerves. "Relax, Raven. I'll handle everything." Brian took her arm and said it gently. With him that close, Raven steadied. She drew a deep breath, and the blue scales across her body flowed like water. Then she became Moira. Brian looked at the result with genuine admiration. It wasn't only that the likeness was perfect. She'd reproduced Moira's CIA uniform down to the detail. "After you, Agent MacTaggart." Brian nodded to her with a small laugh. The two of them walked up to the gate. Two CIA agents turned to look at them immediately. "Stop there." One of them came over, looked Brian up and down with open scrutiny, and then turned to Raven. "Routine verification, please." He brought over an iris scanner and read Raven's eyes. The machine beeped. Every detail of Agent MacTaggart's file came up on the terminal beside them. "Agent MacTaggart. Welcome back." The cold went straight out of his face the moment he saw the screen. Then he looked at Brian. "And this is classified." Raven said it without any particular emphasis. She had met Moira exactly once, and she had her bearing and her manner of speech down perfectly. That is Raven's ability. At that answer, the agent shut his mouth and stopped asking. Agent MacTaggart's clearance was level 6. That is the administrative tier immediately below the CIA's senators. In short, Moira outranked him considerably. She owed him no explanation at all. "Agent MacTaggart, Agent Kent, please, go through." He opened the door, and the two of them walked in. "Agent MacTaggart. Agent MacTaggart. Evening, Agent MacTaggart." Once inside, every administrator and duty agent they passed greeted Raven. Moira was clearly well liked here. Raven nodded back at all of them, entirely calm. She and Brian took in the building as they walked. A guard every 3 paces and a sentry every 5. Not only were there identity checks at every turn, agents would physically search you as well. Every few steps, another verification. But what surprised Raven was how well Moira's identity actually worked. Wearing it, she and Brian had a completely clear run. Until they reached the administrative building, and stopped. Brian looked up at it. This was the CIA's core. Getting in required fingerprint and iris verification. And a purpose-built CIA identity card. Fingerprints and irises confirm who an agent is. The card opens the door. "Brian. What do we do?" Looking at the building ahead, Raven's face fell. America's intelligence service is not easy to walk into. Brian wasn't especially concerned by her expression. Getting in cleanly would be ideal. Not getting in cleanly wasn't a disaster. Worst case, he'd force his way through. "Moira? You've only just got back. Who's this?" Just as Brian was preparing to do exactly that, a CIA agent in a suit came over. He looked at Raven, puzzled, and spoke to her like someone who knew her well. "I'm here to collect Agent Kent." Raven had no idea what this man was to Moira, so it came out slightly stiff. "Agent Kent?" The man in the suit frowned faintly. As the CIA's top field agent, he had no idea when the agency had acquired an Agent Kent. "Hello. I'm Deep Cover. I don't think I caught your name." Brian put out his right hand, smiling, and shook. "Levi. Agent Levi will do." Levi looked at Brian with sudden understanding. No wonder he hadn't heard of the man. Brian was Deep Cover. Tall, good-looking. He'd almost certainly been sent into the Soviet Union on a long-term placement. "Come on. The executive meeting is about to start." Levi gave Brian a polite smile, then took Raven by the arm and walked her toward the administrative building without further discussion. Levi and Raven verified palm print, fingerprint and iris in turn. As for Brian didn't need to. Because Brian was deep cover. Verification done, Levi opened the door with his card and said to Raven. Quickly, Moira. Senator Skrilla is waiting for us. With Levi leading, Brian and Raven reached the Executive Council chamber. A senior CIA intelligence meeting was underway. The international situation had been grim of late. CIA leadership had been pushing agents into the Soviet Union continuously, gathering intelligence, trying to establish what the Soviets were doing. And Moira, sent into the Soviet Union, had just brought something important back. Which was why the emergency meeting had been called. In the chamber, a room full of senior CIA officials sat at high alert. Their faces were grave, and they kept going back over the intelligence documents in their hands. Brian and Raven had barely walked in before a staffer handed each of them a copy. Brian looked down at his. There was a heading across the top of the page. Suspected discovery of a mutant with unusual abilities in the Soviet Union. At the foot of the document, filed by Agent Moira MacTaggart. Brian read it and said, out loud, well, I'll be damned. He had comprehensively wiped Moira's memory and left her with no knowledge that mutants existed. And a few days later she'd gone and found one in the Soviet Union. Brian had no idea what to say to that. Does that woman have some kind of talent for this? Brian muttered it to himself. Agent MacTaggart. Tell us about the mutant you found. While Brian was still processing it, a senior CIA official had crossed to Raven and asked it, grim-faced. The CIA Executive Council chamber. Senator Skrilla came over to Raven, grave-faced, and asked it directly. Agent MacTaggart. Is your intelligence accurate? Raven looked at Brian. She had no idea how to answer him. Sir. What Agent MacTaggart reported is accurate. Brian moved to her side and said it evenly. And you are? Skrilla stopped short at the sight of him, and looked him over with some scrutiny. Brian. Undercover, Soviet Union. Brian said it low. At the words undercover in the Soviet Union, Skrilla's eyes lit up, and he gave the order without patience. Agent Kent. Tell us about this Soviet mutant. At the order, Brian walked unhurriedly to the podium at the front of the chamber, and began to talk. Members of the Council. Mutants have existed for a very long time. At intervals, human genes mutate, and certain people acquire extraordinary abilities. That is a mutant. According to Soviet research, now that humanity has entered the nuclear age, this kind of genetic mutation is accelerating. Which is to say there will be more and more mutants as time goes on. Brian held nothing back. He announced the existence of mutants openly, to a room of senior American intelligence officials. Learning that mutants were real, every executive in the room turned to look at the others. Agent Kent. Is there any way to find these mutants? Skrilla recovered first, and asked it with a very serious face. Senator, the Soviets have developed a method of telling humans and mutants apart. I have not yet obtained it. Brian glanced at him and said it without needing to think. We acquire that method. Whatever it costs. Then we find them. And we put every one of them in a cage. This world belongs to human beings and nobody else. Skrilla's eyes were as sharp as a hawk's, and his voice was full of fear and hatred. Skrilla had never seen a mutant in his life. He hated them thoroughly on the strength of the word alone. Which is, it has to be said, an irony. Senator, perhaps this could be handled with a gentler hand. Raven had heard enough, and said it calmly. A gentler hand? Out of the question. These mutants are errors in human genetic mutation. They're deformities. Freaks. They should be wiped out, all of them. Another council member said it without any feeling at all, backing Skrilla. If mutants really existed in this world, then the appropriate places for them were the grave and the laboratory. Raven looked around at these CIA executives, who made no attempt at all to hide their disgust and their fear. talking openly about putting mutants in cages. About eliminating everyone they found. Something in Raven's chest went very heavy. She had grown up following Professor X, and his thinking had shaped her deeply. Raven wanted the human world. She wanted to belong in human society, and to have humans accept her as a mutant. And looking at this, that idea was naive. Stupid, even. Look at the faces of these people at the top of the human world. They want every mutant dead. The last of the hope in Raven collapsed. She couldn't stop herself looking at Brian, and found that Brian was already looking at her. And Raven understood. Brian had announced mutants to this room deliberately. So that she would see what these people actually were. Bang! While the council was still baying for blood over the news. The closed chamber door was thrown open. And a woman came in at speed, agitated. Damn it, Levi, why didn't you wait for? It was the real Agent MacTaggart. Moira stared at herself standing in the council chamber, and stopped dead. What in God's name? Who are you? Moira pointed at Raven and said it in flat disbelief. At the sound of her voice, a room that had been in uproar went so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. You have got to be kidding me. Why are there two MacTaggarts? The executives, who a moment ago had been debating how to round up every mutant alive, looked at Moira, then at Raven, and were thoroughly lost. What exactly is going on here? Skrilla's eyes went wide, and he hit the alarm on the table in front of him. Buzz. 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 Alarms went off through the whole of CIA headquarters. Within moments, dozens of agents came through the chamber door. Detain both MacTaggarts. And Agent Kent. Anyone who resists is to be shot. Skrilla gave the order. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't know which of the two MacTaggarts was real. And since he didn't know which was real, both of them were fake. Click. At his order, dozens of agents brought weapons up on all three of them. Being a CIA agent herself, Moira raised her hands with excellent instincts and went down into a crouch with them behind her head. Seeing her comply, every eye turned to Brian and Raven. Brian. Looks like we're blown. Facing the suspicion in the room, Raven smiled helplessly. It doesn't matter. If we're blown, we do this the other way. Brian pulled her behind him and said it calmly. Neither of them made any effort to keep that exchange from the CIA officials, who concluded immediately that these two were the fakes. Kill them. Skrilla looked at the pair of them in fury and gave the order again. Dozens of agents closed around Brian and Raven. Click. Rifle muzzles came up on them. Then a senior agent raised a hand, cold-faced, and signaled to open fire. Da-da-da. A dense storm of gunfire swept over them. Facing it, Brian simply put Raven behind him, and under the impact his skin turned to metal. Ding! 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 A run of sharp metallic impacts. Every round the agents fired stopped against Brian's metal skin. None of it did him any harm at all. What the hell is that? Dozens of agents stared at the man made of metal, wide-eyed, and froze. Mutant. This man is a mutant. The color went out of Skrilla's face, and looking at Brian he screamed it in panic. Kill him. Kill him. Watching Skrilla shriek, Brian found he was becoming irritated. He threw out a small tornado, without much thought about it. Boom. The tornado closed over Skrilla instantly. And the small wind blades inside it stripped him to a bloody skeleton. Thud. When the tornado dispersed, the skeleton fell. The chamber went silent again. Under a room full of horrified eyes, Brian rolled his shoulders slightly. Keep firing. Don't stop on my account. Brian said it to the dozens of agents in front of him. What the hell is that? What's a mutant? Christ, he's coming. In the Executive Council chamber of the CIA Administrative Building. Dozens of agents watched Brian walking toward them with fear in their faces and cold sweat on their foreheads. Agent Daniel, a senior man, got his radio out to call it in. Requesting support, requesting support. He hadn't finished the sentence before Brian arrived in front of him like a hurricane. Silver Surfer form let his metal skin stop bullets. It also increased his strength enormously. Not to the level of the Colossus he would one day face. But more than enough for a room of CIA agents. Under Daniel's horrified eyes, Brian raised his right hand, closed it around the man's throat, and lifted him off the floor without effort. Open fire. At the movement, another dense storm of gunfire swept across the room. And achieved nothing whatsoever. Brian ignored the rounds coming into him and looked at Daniel with no expression at all. Then he put a little force into his right arm and threw him into the thickest concentration of agents. Bang! The force behind it sent Daniel through them like a bowling ball through pins. Several agents were knocked clean off their feet and into the chamber wall with a dull sound. And Daniel himself was already more dead than alive. You have got to be kidding me. Eat this, you freak. One agent looked at his dead colleague and lost his temper entirely. He threw his rifle on the floor, brought up the launcher on his back, and put a rocket straight into Brian. Boom. Facing it, Brian simply stood where he was. The heat and the flame swallowed him. I got him. I killed the monster. Watching Brian disappear into the fire, the agent shouted it in triumph. What happened next frightened him past the ability to speak. Brian walked out of the center of the explosion. A rocket detonation could not get through Silver Surfer form. It wasn't even enough to trigger another evolution. Conventional weapons in the hands of CIA agents were simply too weak. To Brian, it was a tickle. And he didn't want to waste time on it. With the whole room watching, Brian snapped his fingers lightly. Behind him, the fire from the rocket blast spun and gathered fast. And an enormous dragon of fire swept out of it. The fire dragon roared at the agents with startling realism, then drove straight into the middle of them. Boom! An enormous explosion. The dragon detonated on contact. Dozens of agents were thrown clear by it. The blast wave alone lifted the ceiling off the chamber. When it cleared, every agent in the room was down, and the casualties were severe. The chamber looked like it had been shelled. Fire tornadoes aren't bad at all. Brian surveyed the result with satisfaction. What he'd used was the tornado ability he'd taken from Riptide. A level 4 ability originally, and in Brian's hands its power was extraordinary. He could also shape a tornado into any form he liked. The fire dragon had been a fire tornado, shaped. With the fighting done, Brian walked over to a group of trembling senior council members. He took hold of a fat man at random and asked him, pleasantly. Tell me. Who runs the CIA's classified research and development base? Senator Foster. Senator Foster has always had the R&D division. The fat man looked at him in terror and gave up his colleague without a second's hesitation. And to make sure Brian would let him go, he personally pointed out which man Foster was. Very good. I'm very satisfied with that answer. Now you can die. Brian took the M1911 out of his pocket and pulled the trigger. Bang! A round went through the fat man's forehead. His eyes went wide, and he died with them open. Raven. Bring Senator Foster. We're leaving. Brian walked over to Foster and picked him up like a chicken. Then he carried him to Raven and handed him over. And flicked a hand to release a tornado. Rumble. A violent tornado tore through the council chamber. The senior council members grabbed desperately at anything within reach and were pulled into it anyway. Then the floor, the ceiling, the table, all of it. Under Brian's control, the entire chamber came apart. The destructive force ripped through the reinforced concrete of the administrative building. And the whole administrative building was split in two. Is that thing even human? It's a monster. It's a monster. How the hell are we supposed to fight that? Outside, the agents rushing to reinforce watched the administrative building being torn into halves. One half began collapsing and breaking apart under the tornado. Even 50 meters out, the pull of it was extraordinary. Agents closest to the building had already begun to stagger, sliding toward the vortex whether they wanted to or not. My God, what is that? One agent looked up at the sky without meaning to. And then screamed. Everyone was drawn round by the sound, and looked where he was looking. And every one of them froze. What did they see? Above the CIA administrative building hung a four-winged angel of extraordinary beauty, looking down at them without any feeling at all. My God! What is that? 4 wings, an angel. An angel has come down. That's an angel. That's an angel. Among the agents, some of the devout put their weapons down and knelt to the figure in the sky. Others were shaking too hard to keep hold of their rifles. What they were looking at sat entirely outside anything they knew. The figure was Brian, in 4-winged angel form. He'd jumped when he released the tornado, and gone high. The weightlessness at altitude made activating the 4-winged form simple. And because he was still holding Silver Surfer form as well. Brian was silver-white from head to foot, and even the wings were metal. The effect was commanding. In his right hand he held Senator Foster, hanging like a dead dog. And Raven clung to him like a koala. God has said that all men are sinners. The whirlwind is sent to sweep the filth from the world. Now, in the name of the 4-winged angel, judgment is passed. Brian's voice carried across the whole of CIA headquarters on the wind. Every one of them stared at the single figure in the sky, transfixed. And saw those beautiful metal wings beat, once, gently. On the ground, dozens of tornadoes rose and went through the whole of CIA headquarters. Human buildings are as fragile as paper against a tornado. With the administrative building at the center, dozens of vortices drove outward in every direction. One building after another simply ceased to exist as they passed. God Almighty, what is Brian doing? Is he announcing mutants to the entire world? Outside the perimeter, Professor X, waiting quietly to collect Brian and Raven, looked at the figure in the sky and at CIA headquarters collapsing, and swore out loud. This is what mutants should be. Humans underfoot. Only mutants are sacred, and only mutants are noble. Where Professor X was appalled, Magneto watched the 4-winged angel with burning eyes. Magneto had found the man he wanted to be. You have got to be joking. Does Brian want the whole world looking at mutants? He's destroying CIA headquarters, how does he dare? Christ, why not the White House while he's at it? Outside CIA headquarters, Professor X looked at the tornadoes tearing through what now resembled a missile strike, and swore himself hoarse. Shut up, Charles. Beside him, Magneto cut the swearing off, black-faced. Sorry, Eric. I lost my temper. Interrupted, Professor X gradually got hold of himself. He looked at the CIA agent still escaping from the wreckage, and his eyes were full of pity and reluctance. Charles. You aren't a fit leader. Professor X's dithering had begun to disappoint Magneto. Then Magneto looked at the fleeing agents himself. And gently raised the one finger he could still move. Whoosh. 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 Not far off, agents running for their lives felt the body armor they were wearing tighten around them. There are mutants over here too. One agent caught sight of Magneto floating in his wheelchair and drew a sharp breath. Then, one after another, the agents were bound up by the metal lining of their own armor and dropped to the ground, unable to move at all. Watching more and more of them come out of the ruins, Magneto frowned slightly. Then raised the finger again. Every piece of metalwork around him lifted off the ground. And condensed into an enormous circular wall of metal, which came down hard. Every escape route out of the site was sealed. Very much a showman's move. Under the horrified eyes of the trapped agents, Magneto crooked the finger again. Every weapon in their hands tore loose and hung in the air. And then, while they watched, all of those muzzles turned and settled on the men who had been holding them. Click. 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 As though a pair of invisible hands were working the guns. Every safety came off. Every round chambered. The agents shut their eyes in despair. That's enough, Eric. And as Magneto prepared to pull dozens of triggers at once, Professor X finally stopped standing by. He used his telepathy to take hold of Magneto directly and stop him killing them. Damn it, Charles, what do you think you're doing? Magneto rounded on him, face like thunder. Eric. The X-Men are meant to stand for justice and protect the human world. Not slaughter ordinary people on a whim. Professor X said it with absolute seriousness. Which made Magneto's expression worse still. Justice? We're mutants. They're human. We were never going to be able to share a world. For a mutant, killing a few humans is nothing at all. Magneto said it with derision all over his face. Mutants are human beings too. Professor X said it with unusual gravity. Swish. While the two of them were arguing, a hurricane came down. Brian appeared in front of them in four-winged angel form. His feet touched the ground and the four wings vanished behind him. He threw Senator Foster down in front of Professor X without ceremony, and set Raven down gently. Brian. Do you have any idea what you've just done? After this, the entire world will unite against mutants. Having only just calmed down, Professor X was furious all over again at the sight of him. Brian glanced at him without any particular concern. And said, lightly, Professor X, humans won't know the X-Men had anything to do with it. Professor X. Mid-fury, Professor X stopped short. Then looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Brian didn't need to answer. Raven, who had given up on humanity entirely, got there first. Charles. We've still got you, haven't we? Professor X turned to her in astonishment, not following. And as though she'd read the question on his face, Raven went on. You use your telepathy to alter the memories of every CIA agent still alive. And nobody will ever know the X-Men destroyed the CIA. Professor X could not believe it. That those words had come out of Raven's mouth. Raven. Do you understand what you're saying? He looked at her with open disappointment, and his voice came out weakly. Of course, Charles. Raven nodded, entirely calm, and glanced back at the terrified agents behind her. We don't have a choice now. You know as well as I do, if human leadership learns it was the X-Men who destroyed the CIA. Then every one of us, you included, becomes an enemy of the human race. Raven said it in earnest. Professor X was quiet for a moment, and then smiled bitterly. He knew perfectly well what would follow if they found out. It would mean mutants exposed to humanity, completely and permanently. And then it wouldn't only be the X-Men. Every mutant in the world would be facing catastrophe. Whatever Professor X believed, he was not going to stand by and watch mutants destroyed. Brian. You intended to use my telepathy from the very beginning. Professor X looked at him for a long moment and said it with a rueful smile. Professor X. We're one body. A team. We help each other. We rise together and we fall together. Brian said it smiling. A team. Professor X repeated it without further comment, and looked past Brian at the agents. Then he raised his right hand and pressed 2 fingers to his temple. Boom. An enormous psychic force went out of him. And covered the whole of CIA headquarters in an instant. Every terrified agent on the site went blank-eyed at the same moment. 1 minute later. Professor X lowered his hand. He had driven his telepathy into the mind of every CIA agent present. And rewritten their memories by force. Professor X erased the X-Men from all of them. And rewrote the reason CIA headquarters had been destroyed. A tornado had come out of nowhere and leveled it. Professor X. Well done. With everything finished, Brian came over and patted his shoulder gently. Welcome to the X-Men, Charles. Raven came over too, patted the other shoulder, and said it smiling. Charles. You're not entirely stupid. Magneto wanted to pat his shoulder as well, but he couldn't move at all, so he settled for tapping the arm of the wheelchair with a finger. Ah. Professor X sighed. To save mutants, Professor X had compromised. He had gone against everything he believed in and used his telepathy to clean up after them. And the young Professor X felt, for the first time, what it is to be out of options. But Professor X swore to himself that this was the last time he would betray his own principles. Oh, Professor X, don't forget to read Senator Foster. We still have to get to the CIA's classified base and find Beast. Brian, already walking away, turned his head to remind him. Professor X looked down at the unconscious Foster, and his eye twitched. Then he sent his telepathy into Foster's mind and read out everything about Hank McCoy. This is the last time I go against what I believe. And with that, Professor X had planted himself another flag. New York. Brooklyn. Early morning. Brian's place. After destroying CIA headquarters, Brian had brought Professor X and the others back to his home. The reason being that Brian's place sat very close to the CIA's classified research base, where Hank McCoy was. Which is how Brian's home became the X-Men's temporary base. Inside the house. Brian and Raven came out of the bedroom looking every inch a couple. And ran into Magneto, sitting in his wheelchair drinking cold beer. Brian. Could the two of you not be quieter? Magneto threw him a bottle and said it with some feeling. We were extremely quiet. In that department, I have certain advantages. Brian shrugged, gave Magneto a look that said weak, then pointed at the can in his own hand and gestured. Magneto felt the contempt land, and his eye twitched. On any other subject he might have argued. On this one, Magneto was fairly sure no man alive compared to Brian. Brian really was formidable. Click. Magneto glanced at the can, and the ring pull lifted itself. Brian took a mouthful and frowned slightly. Not cold enough. More contempt. Magneto really isn't as useful as Iceman. Magneto? He looked at Brian, lost. He had no idea why he was being looked down on a second time. Magneto, you've clearly got a talent for eavesdropping. Why not go and find a woman of your own? Brian was faintly disappointed that nobody had picked the joke up. He said it, then took Raven through to the living room. Oh, get lost. Magneto took a gloomy pull at the beer and swore at his back. Then he looked down at his bandaged body and shook his head. He was still injured. Using his ability yesterday had torn the wound on his shoulder open again. He couldn't move a finger now. Never mind finding a woman, he couldn't look after himself. Brian ignored the whining entirely and brought Raven into the living room. On the sofa, Professor X was watching television with a complicated expression. Breaking news was running. CIA headquarters had been struck by a major tornado in the night. 142 dead, 240 injured to varying degrees. The administrative building had been split in two. Other structures on the site were severely damaged. A number of senior CIA officials were missing following the disaster. Nicely done, Professor X. Watching the report, Brian patted his shoulder gently and delivered the praise with total sincerity. Shut up, Brian. The kindly meant compliment went into Professor X like a knife. He turned and glared. Brian was entirely unaffected by it. Brian. I'm not going to use my telepathy casually anymore. Professor X said it suddenly, with a serious expression. He hadn't slept. Using his power on ordinary people like that had done something to him. And when he saw the news this morning, Professor X understood properly what came of rewriting ordinary people's memories on a whim. And he reached a conclusion. Nothing came of it. That was what frightened him most. Because he had discovered that a man with his power can do whatever he likes. And once that thought arrived, it settled in like a sickness in the bone and would not let go. So he had to use his own power to erase the thought from himself. Professor X understood that he was in real danger. One careless step and he would be gone. Which is why he needed something to hold himself to. And that thing was this: he would never enter another person's mind uninvited. I'd like you to hold me to it, Brian. Having explained, Professor X asked it of him seriously. Why me? Brian offered no opinion on the principle itself. He was more interested in why Professor X wanted him. Because you're the only one who could kill me before I fall. Professor X said it with complete confidence. He had seen Brian's potential in the first engagement with the Hellfire Club. In terms of mutant classification, Brian's potential had gone past level 5. It reached the legendary Omega level. And by Darwin's prophecy, an Omega-level mutant is a god walking on the earth. So Professor X was certain that a man with that potential could stop him if it came to it. Don't worry, Professor X. I'll absolutely kill you. Brian nodded seriously, and meant it in more than one sense. Thank you, Brian. Professor X thanked him with gratitude all over his face. Brian simply patted his shoulder, as though it needed no words at all. All right, boys. Time to go and recruit Hank McCoy. Raven, leaning into Brian's arm, broke the atmosphere. Professor X looked at her. Then, while she watched in confusion, he took her right hand and put it into Brian's. Brian. I'm leaving Raven to you from here. Brian smiled. Professor X, Magneto. You've both just been NTR'd. Professor X. Magneto. Professor X was lost. Even Magneto, who had just steered his wheelchair into the living room, looked distinctly odd about it. Neither of them had any idea what NTR meant. Both of them knew it couldn't be anything good. And for reasons neither could articulate, both felt that they had somehow become the injured parties. Damn it. Oh, get lost. Professor X and Magneto lost their composure simultaneously. One gave Brian the finger. The other lifted every piece of metal in the room and threw it at him. Clang. Clatter. Clang. Brian's skin turned dark brown, like stone, on the spot. Adaptive evolution made him immune to physical attack. Right. Let's talk about Hank McCoy. Seeing there was nothing he could do to Brian, Professor X sighed and steered the subject back. This is the X-Men's first recruitment. Our approach will be gentle. Professor X glanced at Brian and put some weight on the word. Are we all going? Raven looked at him and asked. Eric's condition has got worse. I need to get him to a hospital. You and Brian handle the recruitment this time. You know where the CIA's classified base is in any case. Professor X glanced at Magneto as he said it. Damn it, I'm a founding member of the X-Men. How am I missing our first recruitment? Magneto objected entirely to the arrangement. As far as he was concerned, being a member meant taking part. Eric. Do you want the new recruit's first sight of you to be a mummy? Professor X always knew exactly where to hit him. At that, Magneto deflated immediately. No. The next thing we recruit is a mutant who can heal. Magneto resolved privately that once Hank was in, he'd go and find one. Come on. Let's go and meet this Hank McCoy. The arrangement settled, Brian wasted no words. He jumped where he stood, for angel wings extended from his back, and he took hold of Raven and was gone. Outside a classified military base in New York City. A black Lincoln pulled up slowly at the gate. The guard went to the driver's window, dutifully, and knocked on it. "Inspection, please." At his word, the window came down, revealing a fat man with a considerable stomach. The instant he saw who it was, the guard came to attention and saluted. "Senator Foster. Corporal George. You're very conscientious. Open the gate." The fat man put out his right hand, patted the guard's shoulder, put the window back up and started the car again. "Open her up." Encouraged by the base's most senior officer, the guard picked up his radio and spoke into it. The heavy metal gate began to open. Senator Foster put his foot down and drove straight in. Once they were through, a layer of blue scales spread across Senator Foster, and Raven was back in her own form. In the passenger seat, Brian sat entirely at his leisure. Professor X had already pulled everything about the CIA's classified R&D base out of Foster's mind. And passed all of it to Raven telepathically. Which is why Raven, wearing Foster's face, carried herself and even spoke exactly as the Raoul Foster did. Never mind the guards on the gate. Foster's own wife wouldn't have found a seam. Once inside the classified base, Raven drove to one of the research buildings without hesitating. By Foster's memories, this was the supersonic aircraft facility. And Hank McCoy designed supersonic aircraft. Senator Foster. "A moment, please." Wearing Foster's face, Brian and Raven met no obstacles at all. Inside the building, they ran into a short man. Raven turned toward the voice, and understood immediately who he was. A geneticist Senator Foster had recently brought in. "Dr. Trask. What can I do for you?" Raven asked it in Foster's manner. "Senator Foster. When will the research funding I applied for be approved?" Trask asked it seriously. "You know how it is, Dr. Trask. CIA leadership is deeply pessimistic about your genetics work. As far as they're concerned, your research isn't as compelling as a supersonic fighter." Raven looked down at him and fobbed him off exactly as Foster would have. "Senator Foster, I think you should look at this. My research has made a significant breakthrough." As though he'd expected precisely that answer, Trask produced a document from inside his coat and held it out. "Dr. Trask." Raven was about to turn him down. She had no interest whatsoever in his genetics. Given the choice between a gene report and meeting a fellow mutant, she'd take Hank McCoy. "Dr. Trask. I'm very interested in your research." What Raven had not expected was Brian taking the file out of Trask's hand with genuine curiosity and reading it properly. "And this is?" Trask looked at Brian, puzzled, then turned to Raven. Raven was about to invent a name when Brian got in first. "Scylla. My name is Scylla. I'm the scientific advisor to this facility." Hearing that Brian was the base's scientific advisor, Trask was visibly impressed. "Dr. Scylla. What's your field?" Being a scientist, Trask has always been direct. "I've done some work on the evolution of species." Brian answered without a pause. And then, while Raven stared, Brian and Trask fell into a conversation about species evolution and genetic evolution. The two of them got on famously. Particularly once Brian illustrated the process by which his own body adapts and evolves, by way of practical demonstration. Trask was more impressed still by the depth of Brian's understanding. He felt he'd met the man far too late. Genetics touches on species evolution, but nobody Trask had ever met had gone that deep into it. And the demonstration with the immediacy of first-hand experience left Trask hungry for the subject. "Professor Scylla. I have enormous admiration for what you know." Trask looked up at him and said it with total sincerity. Somewhere in the conversation, Trask's form of address had gone from doctor to professor. Which says everything about his respect. Dr. Trask. Would you tell me how far your genetics project has actually got? Brian accepted the praise calmly. Then asked it with curiosity on his face. Of course, Professor Scylla. Trask shared his findings without any hesitation at all. 3 months earlier, Trask had run a public study to determine whether different people's gene sequences were identical. He'd paid 100 volunteers of different races and both sexes to take part, and collected their blood. And in the blood of one black taxi driver, he'd found an unusual sequence by accident. The man appeared to carry an extra, distinctive X gene. The discovery left Trask elated. He went back and took tissue samples from the man repeatedly. Including, on one occasion, bone marrow. I have to say, that taxi driver was very short of money indeed. Trask said it with some feeling. Dr. Trask. Was the taxi driver called Darwin? Brian asked it with a strange expression. How do you know his name? Trask looked at him in surprise. He hadn't expected Professor Scylla to produce it instantly. So it was Darwin. Brian put a hand to his forehead, then looked at Trask and said, evenly, the reason my own work on species evolution made such a significant breakthrough is entirely down to Darwin. Trask's eyes lit up at that. Then we both owe Mr. Darwin a great deal for his selfless contribution. Brian nodded in agreement. Mr. Darwin has made an indelible contribution to both of us. He's an unsung hero. Brian said it seriously. It's been a genuine pleasure, Professor Scylla. Though it seems I won't be getting funding out of Senator Foster. I'll have to find another route. Let's talk again. Trask said it and walked out of the research building, smiling. Brian, why waste all that time on that little man? Raven looked at him, baffled, and glanced after Trask's retreating back. Raven, he isn't just a little man. He's the man responsible for the extinction of our entire species. And he's the father of the Sentinels. Brian watched Trask go, grave-faced, and said it in earnest. Yes. This Dr. Trask. The future father of the Sentinels. The pivotal figure who turns the future, and builds the machines that wipe out the mutant race. Father of the Sentinels, Bolivar Trask. Trask has no Sentinel program at present. But he has already found the mutant gene, the X gene, inside human DNA, entirely by accident. Bolivar is a genius. And Brian was certain it wouldn't be long before he launched the program. Darwin. You really did deserve to die. The CIA R&D building. Supersonic laboratory. Brian and Raven stepped out of Senator Foster's private lift. And the moment they did, the clicking started up in Brian's mind, ticking off every second. Which surprised him. There was no question about it. There was one of his own kind in this laboratory. Brian followed where the sound in his head pointed and looked into the lab. Inside, a thin scientist in a white lab coat stood in front of a supersonic aircraft, running data tests. That scientist was Brian's target. Hank McCoy. Senator Foster. The supersonic aircraft is finished. As they came in, Hank saw them too. His eyes rested on Brian for a few seconds, then he crossed to Raven and made his report respectfully. Brian, this is Hank McCoy. Looking at him, Raven was faintly let down. She took one of the prophecy comics out of her coat. In it was an enormous, powerfully built blue gorilla. Brian had given her the image of Beast on the way over. A blue-furred gorilla. The thin scientist in front of her fell some distance short of that. Senator Foster, what are you talking about? Hank stopped short and looked at her, confused. He had no idea what beast meant. Raven, the beast you're looking at is what he becomes. The Hank standing here qualifies as a Bigfoot at most. Brian ignored Hank's confusion and explained it to her. Bigfoot? Raven looked down at Hank's feet, puzzled. With his shoes on, there was nothing to see. Senator Foster, what are you talking about? And who is this man? The color went out of Hank's face at the word Bigfoot. He worked hard to keep it off his face, and the panic in his eyes gave him away completely. Senator Foster is dead. You can call me Mystique. Looking at him panicking, Raven shrugged, and shifted back into her own blue form. Bloody hell. Watching Senator Foster become a blue-skinned woman, Hank was shocked, and then something like joy came over his face. I knew I wasn't the only one. Hank was, at that moment, elated. From very early in his life Hank had known he was different from everyone around him. Because he has feet like the Bigfoot of the stories. And it was those feet, so unlike anyone else's, that made Hank a freak in people's mouths as a child. Even his parents gave up on him. Thankfully, whatever gave him the feet also gave him an extraordinary mind. And what happened to him as a child drove every scrap of his attention into study. On the strength of that brain, Hank had come out of an Ivy League university with multiple doctorates by the age of 20. He was recruited directly into the CIA's classified research base. And became a CIA scientist. For years he had been careful, and had hidden what he was without fail. And used CIA resources to quietly look for others like him. He had never found a single one. Which had left him close to despair, as though he were the only alien creature in the world. Which is why the sight of Raven's blue form affected him the way it did. Hank. We're the same as you. You don't need to hide anything in front of us. Raven understood exactly what he was feeling. Mutants are always alone. Even Raven, before she met Professor X, had hidden wherever she could, with everyone's hand against her. Yes. We're the same. Hank looked at her, thrilled, and then, while she watched with interest, took his shoes off. Revealing a pair of feet nothing like a human being's. Bang! Hank couldn't wait to show her what he could do. He bent his knees slightly, sprang, hooked his legs over the wing of the supersonic aircraft, and hung upside down from it. The demonstration did not get the reception he'd hoped for. Hank. Is that all of it? Raven looked up at him hanging from the wing with some disappointment, and lost interest in him entirely. As far as Raven was concerned, his abilities were frankly rubbish. Never mind Professor X and the others. He fell a long way short of her. And set against Brian there was simply no comparison at all. It was the first time Raven had seen how unequal mutants can be. Well. That's my ability. Hank read her disappointment instantly, and the excitement went off his face mid-sentence. He dropped down and said it bitterly. Hank felt small. His ability didn't appear to interest Mystique, a mutant far above him, in the slightest. Hank. Don't run yourself down. You should understand something, there are no useless abilities. Only useless mutants. Brian, silent until now, came over, put a hand on his shoulder, and said it in earnest. No useless abilities. Only useless mutants. Hank stared at him. He looked at the encouragement in Brian's face, and the life came back into his eyes. And along with it, a great deal of warmth toward Brian. Who are you? Hank asked him. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Brian. I belong to a mutant organization. The X-Men. Hank's face filled with curiosity. The X-Men? The X-Men are a mutant organization. We are committed to uniting the weaker mutants and standing together against the evil ones. Stopping them from using their abilities to tear down the stability of the human world. My heart is clear and my hands are clean. Everything we do is just. We are the dawn of mutant kind, and the saviors of humanity. We are avengers. Brian delivered all of it with fervor. It took a handful of sentences to have Hank completely taken with the X-Men. Especially my heart is clear and my hands are clean, and everything we do is just. That is the solemn declaration of a guardian of justice. As for the last part, Avengers. Hank knew something about that too. The Avengers are a superhero team in a comic book. dedicated to protecting human society from evil. Mr. Kent, can I join the Avengers, sorry, the X-Men? There was no need to recruit Hank at all. After Brian's spiel, Hank asked to join of his own accord. To lend his own strength to the growth of the X-Men. Of course, Hank. That's exactly why we're here. There's a prophet among the X-Men who sees the future. He saw you joining us a long time ago. Brian patted his shoulder and said it smiling. The X-Men have a prophet? And what does my future look like, in his prediction? Hank asked it with excitement and curiosity both. In the future, you'll be strong, wild, and brilliant. Brian said it seriously. He wasn't lying this time. That is exactly what Beast becomes. Hank. This is your future. Raven, being helpful, handed him the prophecy comic. The color went out of Hank's face the moment he saw it. That's the blue gorilla. That's what I turn into. Hank felt as though he'd been struck by lightning. He did not want that at all. And in that moment, Hank resolved to suppress his mutation. Right. We should be getting back. Recruitment concluded, Brian looked at the supersonic aircraft behind Hank. Hank. You can fly a plane, I take it. Not knowing where this was going, Hank answered with confidence, of course, Mr. Kent. I've been trained. Excellent. Then fly that one out of here. Brian opened the aircraft's door and walked in without hurrying. Raven followed him, leaving Hank standing there for quite some time. Hank, why are you still standing there? Have you forgotten what I said? My heart is clear and my hands are clean. Everything I do is just. Never mind flying off with one CIA aircraft, destroying the entire CIA would be a just act. Brian settled into the co-pilot's seat and called it back at him. That's what that line means. Hank boarded in a daze and sat down at the controls. He had a persistent feeling that Brian's interpretation of it was somehow wrong, but out of trust in his own kind, Hank swallowed the doubt and started the engines. Boom. The aircraft came alive with a deafening roar. Then it ran the length of the internal runway and out of the CIA's classified research base. Boom. A fighter aircraft tore across the sky over Brooklyn. The shockwave off the sonic boom spread outward and blew out windows across several buildings. Pedestrians on the ground were deafened and stood there unable to recover. Christ, are the Soviets attacking? Some people looked up at the fighter and screamed in fear. And in the two-story house at number 233, Brooklyn, Professor X and Magneto, just back from the hospital, heard the boom go over. Professor X looked outside, confused, and saw the panicking crowd, which made him reach for his telepathy without thinking. And with it he saw the supersonic fighter coming slowly into land. And Brian, Raven and Hank McCoy aboard it. Reading Raven's memory told Professor X everything. Good God. Brian has stolen the only supersonic fighter in America. The color went out of his face. Magnificent. That's our Homelander for you. The man really does do whatever he wants. From his wheelchair, Magneto said it with delight. He was finding more and more that, set against a Professor X who was soft and easily pushed around. Brian was very much to his taste. Brian acted without scruple and without dithering. And his position was completely clear. Brian had never once counted himself a member of the human race. He stood squarely with mutants. Which was what Magneto admired about him more than anything. Shut up, Eric. Professor X snapped it at him, and then had no choice but to push his telepathy out again and erase the memories of every panicking person on the street. Charles. Didn't you say you weren't going to use your power casually anymore? Magneto slid the knife in at exactly the right moment, and Professor X's face got worse. This is the last time. He said it without the slightest guilt. Clearly, he had begun to get used to that particular excuse. Boom. While the two of them were talking, the fighter had already touched down on the roof of Brian's house. The hatch opened, and the three of them came out. "You designed this, Hank. It takes off and lands vertically." Raven looked at him in surprise, thoroughly curious about the most advanced aircraft in the world. "That's right, Raven. I developed this one myself." Hank said it with pride. In mutant terms he might not measure up to Raven's shape-shifting. But in research, Hank considered himself second to nobody. "Hank. Do you have the design drawings for this aircraft?" Brian, walking ahead of them, stopped and turned back to ask it. Hank and Raven both stopped and looked at him, surprised. And as though he'd seen the question on their faces. Brian went on, "I'm simply interested in the aircraft. I'd like to see what the design of a supersonic plane looks like." Which they both accepted immediately. Brian. "Here, the supersonic design." Hank went back to the aircraft and brought a technical file out of the cockpit. The file held every drawing for the aircraft. More than 100 pages of them. Hank had been keeping it in the cockpit for reference during testing, so he could check it whenever he needed to. With the design in his hands, Brian smiled. Seeing through the operating laws of all things isn't only the ability that lets him take other mutants' powers. It applies just as well to machinery. One look at a blueprint and he grasps how the machine is made, and can improve the design on the spot. Which lets Brian build technology more advanced and more capable than the original. That was why he'd asked Hank for the drawings. Having glanced at the file, Brian didn't read it there. He handed it to Raven to look after. Then walked over to Professor X. "Professor X, Hank McCoy is an X-Man now." Brian ignored the grim expression entirely and delivered the news. "Hank McCoy. Welcome to the X-Men. I'm Charles Xavier. You can call me Professor X." Looking at how little Brian cared, Professor X sighed and let it go. "Hello, Professor X, Hank is fine." Hank looked at him with curiosity, and his eyes lingered on Professor X's hair for a moment, and he visibly wanted to ask something. Professor X didn't need telepathy to know what it was. "I am not bald, and I am not in a wheelchair." That version of Professor X comes from Brian, and it's Darwin's prediction. "Hank, you should know that predictions aren't always accurate." Professor X explained it wearily. That evening, they held a welcome party for Hank. At which everyone showed him their abilities in turn. And Brian gave a straightforward demonstration of adaptive evolution. Learning what the X-Men could do left Hank stunned. Particularly once he understood what Brian's ability actually was. Hank was seized by the urge to study him. As a scientist, Hank understood exactly what an ability like that meant. "Brian, could I take a tube of your blood?" Hank looked at him with burning eyes. "Hank. Could I beat you to death?" Brian asked it back, smiling. Hank laughed awkwardly and never raised the subject again. Brian left him to it. He took a drink back to his room alone, and opened the supersonic blueprints he'd got from Hank. And began to read. As he read, the mechanical ticking started up again in his mind, marking off every second. Drawings that were dense and illegible as scribble to anyone else became perfectly simple inside Brian's head. A single glance and he had understood and absorbed everything the blueprint contained. More than 100 drawings, read in half a minute. And when Brian set the file down, his mind held the entire design and manufacture of a supersonic aircraft. Seeing through the operating laws of all things. It gave him the whole of it in an instant. He could now do what Tony Stark did. Lock him in a cave. And Brian could knock together a supersonic fighter out of the scrap around him, piece by piece. And the one he built by hand would be more advanced and more refined than Hank's. This is knowledge, and more than that, it is skill. And Brian now held both of them perfectly. Give him a blueprint, and he can learn any piece of technology at a glance and build it without difficulty. That is the power of seeing through the operating laws of all things. Never mind a supersonic fighter. Give him the drawings for a Gundam and he could build one with his bare hands. The only thing he'd be short of is raw material. Brian's most powerful ability has never been adaptive evolution. It has always been seeing through the operating laws of all things. New York. Westchester. One of the wealthiest districts in the state. And at the center of Westchester stands an old and magnificent estate covering 70,000 square feet. A supersonic aircraft came down out of the cloud and set itself neatly on the estate's enormous football pitch. The hatch opened, and Professor X came out first. Then Magneto, Mystique, Raven, and Hank McCoy, newly joined. They had barely stepped clear before Brian came down out of the sky in four-winged angel form and landed in front of them. His feet touched the grass and the wings regressed and vanished. X-Men. Welcome to Xavier Manor. Professor X spread his arms in front of the old house, with the easy generosity of the obscenely rich. Brian looked at the place. And was thoroughly envious. It has to be said that Professor X is genuinely wealthy. The Xaviers were true aristocracy in the 18th century. The family has come down in the world since. But a camel, even starved, is bigger than a horse. This 18th century estate is worth tens of billions of dollars. Never mind the antiques and artworks kept inside it. Professor X led them on a short tour. And the place really is enormous. The estate has everything. Underground, along with an enormous car park, there are several nuclear shelters. The house could hold tens of thousands of people at once without feeling full. Brian was impressed at every turn. He saw several Picassos on the way round. Every one of them priceless. And he finally understood how Professor X would one day found Xavier's school for gifted youngsters and fund it out of his own pocket to teach mutant children for free. Professor X really is extremely rich. This is Xavier Manor. From now on it's the X-Men's base. The tour finished, Professor X made it official. Magneto. Brian. Hank. From today this is your home as well. You'll be living and training here for a long time to come. He said it sincerely. The X-Men had existed for a matter of days. And Professor X had already, without anyone noticing, begun to develop something like the bearing of a leader. The power of cash. Very nearly a superpower in its own right. Brian had no objection to any of it. All right. Take any room you like. Rest today. We'll discuss the X-Men's next steps tomorrow. Professor X kept it brief, and everyone went their separate ways. Brian. Over here. Once Brian had left Professor X's room, Raven waved him over. With Brian following her, curious, she brought him to the room she'd lived in as a child. Brian. From today, you live here. Raven said it smiling. That was the plan. Brian put an arm around her and steered her toward the bed. Neither of them slept. When the sun came up the next morning, Brian stopped at a sensible point. Somehow it's tomorrow already. Brian set Raven down and went over to the French windows. The gold of the sunlight fell across him and showed him off rather well. Behind him, an exhausted Raven let the blue scales run across her body and shifted back into her own form. And the exhaustion went out of her completely. Come on, Raven. The X-Men's first strategy meeting is about to start. Brian dressed, took Raven, back in her blue form, and led her out of the bedroom. Outside, he found Hank cleaning the supersonic aircraft. Hank wasn't wearing shoes. Both feet were simply out, uncovered. Morning, Hank. Remember, mutants don't need to hide. Brian said it in passing. Hank nodded seriously. While the two of them were talking, Professor X arrived pushing Magneto. Today was the X-Men's first proper strategy meeting. Professor X had dressed for it and looked thoroughly energetic. And Magneto had taken the bandages off and put on a black suit. Right. Everyone's here. Let's talk about what the X-Men do next. Professor X opened. Then looked at Hank. Brian said Hank might be able to help us find more mutants. Hank, can you? At the question, Hank paused, and then went into deep thought. Since joining the day before, he'd learned everyone's abilities in detail. And at this moment his mind was moving very fast. After a few minutes, Hank surfaced and nodded. Professor X, your ability is telepathy. Which means you can tell humans and mutants apart. I could try building a brainwave amplifier. It might extend your telepathic range. Though I'd need you to work with me on some testing. Hank really is the finest inventor among mutants. Inside a few minutes he'd produced the outline of the machine. A brainwave amplifier. That might genuinely work. Hank, do it. I'll fund whatever you need. Professor X smiled. Darwin's prediction really was accurate. I'll have it built as fast as I can. Hank nodded seriously. In mutant terms he might be the weakest of the X-Men. As an inventor, he was confident he was the strongest by a distance. With Hank's promise made, Professor X turned to Brian. Brian. While you were recruiting Hank, I found a mutant in Queens. I'd like you to go to Queens and try to bring them into the X-Men. He asked it rather than ordering it. Brian had been somewhere else entirely, and at the words recruit a mutant, his eyes lit up. Leave it with me, Professor X. I'll do everything I can to persuade them into the X-Men family. Brian gave a small salute with his right hand to signal he had it, looking extremely willing. Professor X smiled with some relief at how willing he was. He passed on what he'd found about the mutant, then turned to Raven. Raven. I need you inside the CIA, gathering what they have on the Hellfire Club. Professor X said it low. Raven's ability is better suited to intelligence work than anyone's. Understood, Professor X. Raven nodded and accepted it. Don't worry, Raven. I'll be covering you telepathically. Professor X put a hand on her shoulder and promised it in earnest. If he hadn't needed to work with Hank on the amplifier tests, Raven wouldn't have had to take the risk at all. And me? Professor X. From the wheelchair, Magneto frowned at him and asked it. Eric, you rest and recover here at the manor. Professor X glanced at him and said it evenly. Damn it, Charles. Are you writing me off? Something in the way Professor X looked at him made Magneto feel written off. Why did everyone else have a job and not him? Magneto was not happy about it. Watching him glare at Professor X, Brian rubbed his chin and said. Let Magneto come with me to invite the mutant. If it's only an invitation, there shouldn't be any danger in it. What do you think, Professor X? Fine. We'll do it your way, Brian. You and Magneto go and invite our new companion. Professor X glanced at Magneto and agreed to the suggestion. Thank you, Brian. Magneto nodded to him with real gratitude. Don't mention it, Magneto. Brian patted his shoulder, smiling. The reason Brian had suggested taking Magneto along was that he needed Magneto to vouch for him. Queens, New York. An old circus. Brian and Magneto came through the crowd to a magic booth. On it, a man in a magician's costume was performing. He threw an apple into the air. And it stopped there. The levitation drew applause from the spectators around the booth. And the attention of Brian and Magneto. The two of them exchanged a glance and watched the rest of the act quietly. Under their eyes, the magician took a deck of cards out of his pocket. Then turned his right hand, and the cards lifted into the air and began to circle him. Like something alive. Wonderful, Jonathan. That is an extraordinary act. Mr. Jonathan, your levitation work is remarkable. 10 minutes later the show ended. The onlookers dropped tips into the cash box at the side, one by one, praising him as they went. "Thank you." Jonathan bowed to them gracefully, and then looked over at Brian and Magneto. Of everyone watching, only the two of them had put nothing in. "Sir. If my magic surprised you, don't be shy with your money." Jonathan came over to Brian, took his hat off with a flourish, and held it out. Brian glanced into the hat, then smiled and said to Magneto. "Magneto. Let's do some magic for Mr. Jonathan as well. I do hope ours doesn't frighten him." Magneto nodded, and tapped the arm of his wheelchair. The wheelchair rose into the air. Bloody hell. Watching Magneto lift off the ground, Jonathan's face filled with shock. And while he was still processing it, Magneto raised his right hand. Every piece of metal in the circus, the Ferris wheel included, went up into the air. The crowd let out a collective gasp. And then began to applaud. Evidently they thought it was part of the show. The circus staff, meanwhile, had gone white. And Jonathan looked at Magneto with something close to excitement. "You're mutants too." Jonathan could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had awakened his ability at 12. He called it telekinesis. He can move objects with his mind. At first only small ones. As he got older and trained constantly, his telekinesis grew quickly. He can now move anything up to 100 kilograms. And telekinesis made him a very capable magician. The levitation work had earned him a great deal of applause over the years. And for years he had quietly been looking for others like himself. Without success. Gradually he'd given up on the idea of finding his own kind. And then, just as he'd stopped looking, Brian and Magneto turned up in front of him. "Mr. Jonathan, allow me to introduce ourselves. We belong to a mutant organization, the X-Men. Our organization is committed to uniting mutants and building an ideal world for them, free of human discrimination and persecution." Brian came over and delivered it with total gravity. The X-Men. An ideal world for mutants. Jonathan was deeply moved. He had spent years being careful. Outside of his act. He never dared use his ability at all. He was afraid of being taken as something inhuman, and locked in a laboratory to be dissected. So Brian's words had Jonathan wanting to join the X-Men immediately, and to give what he had to that ideal world. "Jonathan. This isn't the place for this conversation." Brian looked around the circus and said it evenly. "Come to my room." Jonathan nodded and took the two of them back to where he lived. "Homelander, can I join the X-Men?" Jonathan asked at the moment they were inside. "Of course. If you're a mutant. And if you have justice in your heart. Then you can join the X-Men family. And become a member of the Justice League." Brian said it smiling. "But before you join, Jonathan, you'll need to show us what you can do." Jonathan nodded hurriedly at that. Then opened his right hand. Invisible telekinesis closed over Brian at once. Brian's body was driven back against the wall, entirely out of his control. Jonathan flicked his hand again, and Brian was hauled across to the other side of the room like a kite on a string. "As you can see, my ability is telekinesis. I can control anything up to 100 kilograms. Jonathan raised his hand again, and the coffee cup in the living room filled itself and drifted down in front of Brian and Magneto. Telekinesis. Hearing what Jonathan's ability was, Brian's eyes lit up, and he looked at Jonathan the way a man looks at a lamb before slaughter. An offensive option was exactly what he'd been short of. Riptide's tornado is enormously powerful. But it's too powerful, far too indiscriminate for a straight fight. Telekinesis would cover precisely that gap. And telekinesis is, by nature, an all-purpose ability. Brian intended to have it. "Jonathan. Do you have a bathroom here?" Having finished his coffee, Brian stood and asked it. Jonathan pointed the way without thinking. Brian nodded, went in, and shut the door. Whoosh! The moment it closed, Brian whistled. Low, and sharp. Magneto and Jonathan both heard it outside. And neither thought anything of it. Bang! In the bathroom, Brian waited. 3 seconds later, a cloud of red mist formed in the room. And Azazel stepped out of it. Azazel. I need you to take someone. Brian said it without ceremony. Who? Azazel asked, frowning. Jonathan. Brian described him. Azazel gave him a look, then became red mist and was gone. In Jonathan's living room. Magneto was talking with Jonathan. More precisely, Jonathan was interrogating Magneto about the X-Men and about mutants. Magneto, who exactly are the X-Men? What other mutant organizations are there? What can you do? Magneto was thoroughly worn down by the questions and frowned. Be quiet, Jonathan. He barked it, and Jonathan shut his mouth immediately. Bang! And just as Magneto was enjoying a rare moment of silence, red mist bloomed between the two of them. Azazel? The instant he saw it, Magneto recognized the signature of the Hellfire Club teleporter. And braced himself for a serious fight. Bang! The moment Azazel appeared, Magneto had already sent metal at him. Azazel ignored it entirely. His tail wrapped around a thoroughly stunned Jonathan. And teleported them both out of the room. You have got to be joking. Brian, get out here. Azazel's taken Jonathan. Magneto swore, then used his ability to pull the bathroom door open and shouted it in. What? Azazel took Jonathan. Brian looked appalled, and rounded on Magneto. Damn it, Magneto. Why didn't you stop him? Magneto had no answer to that. It was teleportation. How exactly does one stop teleportation? It seems we've failed here. Magneto, go and tell Professor X. I'll see whether Azazel is still nearby. Brian said it in a hurry and went straight out of the room. He had no time to waste on Magneto. He was going to harvest Jonathan's ability. In the crowded circus. Brian appeared to be in a great hurry. He looked around him as though searching for someone. The behavior drew a good deal of attention. Brian paid none of it any mind and kept moving through the crowd until he was out of everyone's sight. At which point he stepped into a dark, empty corner. And the moment he was in it, he smiled. The urgency and the anxiety were entirely gone. That way, even if Professor X uses his ability to look into this, he won't suspect me. Brian leaned against the wall, lit a cigarette without hurrying, and said it smiling. The rushing about had been a performance staged for Professor X. Brian knew exactly what sort of man he was. The moment he learned that Jonathan, about to join the X-Men, had been taken by Azazel. Professor X would almost certainly use his ability at once to hunt for Azazel. In order to get Jonathan back. So after splitting up with Magneto, Brian hadn't contacted Azazel straight away. He'd put on this performance first. Once he was certain there was nobody nearby, Brian whistled. Bang! Azazel appeared in front of him instantly. The whistle was the signal the two of them had agreed on long before. A specific frequency stimulates the psychic imprint in Azazel's brain. So that wherever Azazel happens to be, he registers Brian's whistle and teleports to him. Bang! Azazel dropped the unconscious Jonathan on the ground without ceremony. Brian. I hope you remember what you promised. Azazel looked at him for a long moment and reminded him. Of course. I never forget. Brian shrugged, then asked, seriously. What's Shaw doing? Azazel was quiet for a moment, and then briefed him on Shaw's recent movements. Shaw has recruited another powerful level 4 mutant. Since the fight with the X-Men. The Hellfire Club had been a man down, thanks to Riptide's disappearance. And Shaw had come to understand exactly how strong the X-Men were. Brian in particular. So, to avoid a second failure, Shaw had gone personally to Siberia, where he found a mutant called Ursa Major, who can turn into a brown bear. At the same time, Shaw had used the White Queen's telepathy to take control of more than a dozen senior Soviet officials. And through them, Shaw had built a helmet that blocks telepathy. He had also acquired a nuclear submarine. At present, Shaw has that submarine sitting inside the Arctic Circle. By Azazel's intelligence, Shaw is currently hunting for the X-Men, intending to take Brian and the rest of them all at once. A level 4 called Ursa Major. The first mutant to awaken in the Soviet Union, a bear's strength and a bear's hide. Brian worked through what Azazel had given him. He knew something about Ursa Major already. The man is very similar to Hank McCoy. Hank becomes a blue-furred gorilla and gains a gorilla's strength, speed and agility. Ursa Major becomes a 3-meter Siberian brown bear. And in that form he gains a bear's strength, a bear's endurance and a bear's resilience. In theory, Ursa Major beats Hank. So with Ursa Major aboard, the Hellfire Club had taken a genuinely epic upgrade. As for Shaw hunting for the X-Men's location, Brian didn't care about that. What actually concerned him was the helmet that blocks telepathy. Because it meant Shaw no longer had a weakness at all. "All right, Azazel. You can go." Brian waved him off, which made Azazel frown. "Brian. Don't forget what you promised." Azazel said it a second time, then became red mist and was gone. Once Brian was satisfied he'd left, he turned to Jonathan, unconscious on the ground. He went to him without wasting any time. Then set the dagger he carried against Jonathan's forehead. There was the sound of tissue parting, and Brian opened Jonathan's skull with practiced ease. Then he crouched by the man's head and studied the complex circuitry inside. There. A minute later, Brian found the circuit that carried the ability. Seeing through the operating laws of all things handed it to him instantly. And when Brian stood up, he had complete mastery of telekinesis. Brian put out his right hand. Telekinesis went out of him. And Jonathan lifted off the ground. Brian closed his right hand into a fist. The invisible force crushed Jonathan's body in an instant. What came down was a fine red mist. The body disposed of, telekinesis lifted Brian into the air. Whoosh! Air tore around him and Brian's body shot forward at speed. Jonathan's telekinesis could never have done that. Jonathan was a level 3 mutant at the very best. But once Brian opened Jonathan's skull and took the ability, it went straight to maximum, and came out at the strength of a level 5. Brian's telekinesis can now lift hundreds of tons without effort. Its reach extends an extraordinary 3 kilometers. And his control over it is total. He can move every object around him with a thought. He can also release it outward as a telekinetic shockwave. At full release, Brian could destroy everything within 3 kilometers. And level 5 telekinesis is certainly capable of more than that. Brian could feel that it would keep growing as his own psychic strength did. If Brian ever reaches Professor X's level of psychic power, telekinesis alone would let him flatten a city. Beyond moving objects, Brian can also use it to fly. The speed doesn't match his 4-winged angel form. But it is completely silent. And telekinetic flight still reaches 150 kilometers an hour. Along with flight, Brian can raise telekinetic barriers and build an absolute defensive field. Telekinesis is an all-purpose ability. And most importantly of all, Brian no longer needs a dagger to open a skull. He can do the whole thing telekinetically. Simple, convenient and efficient. With Jonathan's telekinesis, Brian's strength has taken a considerable leap. He no longer has to stand there absorbing attacks to trigger adaptive evolution. Brian is now a level 5 telekinetic mutant. And no sooner had Brian flown clear of the circus than an enormous psychic wave came through behind him. Everyone in the circus stopped where they stood, as though time had halted. It was several seconds before they came back to themselves. And the psychic force withdrew like a tide going out. That power had come from Professor X. I'm sorry, Magneto. I can't find any trace of Jonathan. At Xavier Manor, Professor X lowered his right hand and said it with some regret. I'm afraid Jonathan has been taken by Azazel. My mission failed, Professor X. Xavier Manor. The X-Men's meeting room. Brian reproached himself, helplessly. After taking Jonathan's telekinesis, he had gone straight back to the manor. Watching him blame himself, Professor X came over and patted his shoulder gently. It isn't your fault. If anyone's to blame, it's Azazel. That teleportation genuinely has no counter. Professor X said it calmly, by way of comfort. Jonathan was dead. And Professor X felt nothing much about it. The man had been a stranger, after all. If he was dead, he was dead. That Professor X had used his telepathy to search at all was already a courtesy extended to a fellow mutant. Everyone. I think the Hellfire Club may have marked us. Comfort delivered, Professor X said it grimly. A shadow went over the X-Men at that. Azazel had arrived far too fast. Which can only mean one thing. The X-Men's movements are fully exposed to the Hellfire Club. For an organization this new, that is a serious blow. Hank. Speed things up. Professor X looked at him and said it low. Hank nodded, expression serious. He understood how bad the situation was. The X-Men might now be entirely visible to the Hellfire Club. And at any moment, Shaw might move on them. At the X-Men's current strength, only Brian can put up any resistance to Shaw at all. They are still far too weak. It's all on you, Hank. The sooner the brainwave amplifier exists, the sooner Professor X's ability is working at its full range. Brian patted his shoulder and said it in earnest. Give me 10 days. No, 7. I'll have the brainwave amplifier finished. Hank promised it to him. Brian gave the fired-up Hank McCoy a smile with rather a lot behind it. 7 days went by. With the Hellfire Club pressing, Professor X issued no operations. Only Raven, covered by Professor X, went into the CIA now and then for intelligence. Every other member of the X-Men stayed inside Xavier Manor. At present, in Brian's room. Brian sat on the sofa and raised a hand, and a beer flew out of the refrigerator into it. The ring pull lifted itself. Brian took a mouthful and settled in to continue doing nothing. But a delighted shout interrupted the plan. It works. I've done it. Outside, Hank was shouting. He's finally cracked it. Hearing him, Brian got straight up, excited himself. He waved his right hand, and the door in front of him opened. Then Brian left the bedroom and went outside. Morning, Brian. At the door, Brian ran into Magneto. 7 days of recovery had finally got Magneto out of the wheelchair. His injuries weren't fully healed. But they no longer interfered with getting through a day. Morning, Magneto. Brian nodded to him, and the two of them went out together. Out on the enormous lawn at the center of the manor, Hank stood in a white lab coat holding an instrument, aiming it at the giant radar antenna 2 kilometers away and adjusting something continuously. Seeing Brian and Magneto arrive, Hank nodded to them both, then said to Magneto. Perfect timing, Magneto. Use your ability to turn that radar around. Magneto looked at the giant dish 2 kilometers off and frowned slightly. He had never tried to move a piece of metal that large. But he'd only just got back on his feet and rather wanted to show what he could do. So he didn't refuse. He put both hands out and engaged his ability. The giant radar 2 kilometers away shuddered faintly. Magneto put everything he had into turning it. And however hard he pushed, the dish swayed slightly and then went still again. It did not turn at all. Damn it, move. Magneto roared it, veins standing out across his forehead as he pushed harder still. But 2 kilometers separated him from the dish. And at this point in his life, that distance is simply too far for Magneto. However hard he tried, the radar did not shift. No. I can't do it. Magneto said it to Hank, deflated as a punctured ball. Let me. Brian's voice. Magneto and Hank both turned to look at him. Brian, isn't your ability survival of the fittest? Hank looked at him, confused. He knew perfectly well that Brian's ability was survival of the fittest, and that it had enormous potential. He also knew Brian had no active offensive capability. Remember Jonathan? Brian didn't answer him directly. He asked it back. Of course. The level 3 telekinetic. Hank and Magneto both nodded. It had been 7 days. Neither of them was going to forget. When Jonathan demonstrated his telekinesis, my body seems to have adapted to it. And evolved. Brian said it calmly. Brian, are you saying you've adapted another mutant ability? Professor X had come out onto the lawn and caught the tail of it. He asked it at once, surprise all over his face. Yes, Professor X. I've adapted a new mutant ability. Telekinesis. Brian nodded, entirely certain about it. Professor X didn't doubt any of it. He had watched Brian adapt memory deletion before. That one was very weak, a few days of an ordinary person's memory and no more. So he was simply surprised that Brian had adapted a second ability. Is your telekinesis the same as Jonathan's? Hank asked it, curious. No. Not the same. Mine is somewhat stronger than Jonathan's, in fact. As he said it, Brian opened his right hand toward the giant radar 2 kilometers away. And turned his wrist. Boom. 2 kilometers off, the giant radar dish turned over as easily as a toy. Magneto stared. Professor X and Hank were both astonished. Excellent, that's the last stage of the brainwave amplification finished. Hank adjusted his instrument quickly and fed Professor X's brainwave frequency into the dish. Congratulations, Brian. You've gained a new ability. And the telekinesis you've adapted is a great deal stronger than Jonathan's. Professor X congratulated him sincerely. At no point did the professor doubt a word of it. Taking another person's ability by cutting open their brain is simply too outlandish to occur to anyone. And as for why the ability he adapted happened to be Jonathan's telekinesis, Brian had already explained that, when Jonathan used his power, Brian's body adapted to it and evolved the same thing. Xavier Manor. The X-Men gathered in front of a metal door marked with an X, 7 sleepless days of work, with Professor X's cooperation. And Mutantkin's genius inventor, Hank McCoy, had built a brainwave amplifier capable of extending psychic power. Now Professor X was about to put the helmet on and test it. If it worked, the X-Men's strength would take a genuinely epic upgrade. At Hank's signal, Professor X stood in front of the metal door. A scanning beam came out of the center of the X and read his eyes. Verification accepted. A mechanical voice, and the door opened. While building the amplifier, Hank had converted this nuclear shelter into an amplification chamber. And layered several protective measures into it to keep whoever was inside safe. The X chamber is, without much argument, the safest place in Xavier Manor. Even if Shaw's plan were carried out successfully, they could shelter in the X chamber and survive the detonation. Come on. Let's look at what Hank has built. Professor X went in first. Hank had given the whole chamber a thoroughly futuristic finish. Silver-white LED displays lined the walls. They show whatever the amplifier sees. At the center of the chamber stands a raised platform. And on it, a specialized helmet. Professor X, just put the helmet on. The amplifier starts by itself. Hank picked it up and handed it over. Professor X had barely taken it when Brian started. Professor X, shaving your head might improve signal transmission. Professor X's face darkened. Nobody touches my hair. He said it lightly enough, and put the helmet on. Buzz. The moment it was on, the amplifier came alive. Professor X's psychic power connected into it, and radiated out through the giant radar antenna 2 kilometers away. Professor X felt his own power climbing at a speed he could barely credit. And around him, psychic projections surfaced in enormous numbers. It's working, Professor X, how does it feel? Hank asked it, thrilled. It feels extraordinary. Better than anything I've felt before. My consciousness is connected to every human being on Earth. I feel as though I could do anything. Professor X was elated himself. The amplifier was better than he had expected. Under it, his consciousness had covered the world in an instant. He could hear every voice. Feel every thought. Their joy and their grief and their anger, all of it. Professor X's psychic power reached its ceiling in that moment. And he felt that a single thought would let him wipe out the consciousness of the entire human race. He couldn't stop himself pushing harder. And as his power climbed, every human being on Earth, human and mutant alike, was hit by a splitting headache. Even Magneto, Hank and Raven, standing beside him, clutched their heads in pain. Only Brian, whose body adapted psychic shielding instantly, was immune to it. Professor X, don't let the power blind you. Seeing what was happening to the others, Brian walked over and pulled the helmet off his head by force. Professor X, lost in the pleasure of all that power, felt it drop away the moment the helmet came off. My power. Losing that sense of omnipotence left him bereft. And then he took a punch to the face from Brian. Bang! Brian used no ability at all, and Professor X's right eye went purple regardless. Brian, what are you doing? Struck without warning, Professor X demanded it furiously. Professor X. You very nearly killed everyone. The anger went out of him instantly. He looked at the pain on the faces of Magneto and the others, and his own filled with self-reproach. I'm sorry, Brian. If it weren't for you, I would have done something unforgivable. Professor X thanked him sincerely. Brian put his fist away. He hadn't especially wanted to hit him. But the self-satisfied, omnipotent look on Professor X's face had genuinely deserved it. Brian hadn't been able to help himself. Professor X, you almost killed us. Magneto recovered first, and roared it at him. I'm sorry, Eric. Professor X apologized to Magneto, Hank and Raven, contrite. Then made a suggestion to Hank. Hank, I think the amplifier needs an alarm. To stop me exterminating the human race without noticing. Hank nodded, went back to his room, brought out the amplifier's schematics, and started designing one in. But genius inventor or not, modifying something that complex would take Hank the better part of 10 days. And while he was working over the drawings, Brian appeared behind him without anyone noticing, and glanced at the schematics. One glance. And Brian had complete mastery of how the amplifier is built and how it is operated. Seeing through the operating laws of all things also handed him, instantly, an optimized design for a better one. Along with the method for making the modification. Hank, I think the alarm should go here. Brian pointed at the drawing without much ceremony, and Hank's eyes lit up. You're absolutely right, Brian. Hank gave him a thumbs up, then went straight to the central console and started fitting the alarm. An hour later, Hank wiped the sweat off his face and handed the helmet back. Professor X drew a deep breath and put it on again. His consciousness connected to the whole of humanity a second time. And the global projection filled the X chamber again. This time, the professor did not lose himself in the sensation. He began instead to filter the ordinary humans out. Swish. And what remained in the chamber were the projections glowing red. Red is the marker of a mutant. I found them. I found them. Professor X smiled. It was the first time he had ever felt so many of his own kind. Set against the human population, the mutants number only tens of thousands. It moved him regardless. Especially since he could feel what every one of them was thinking. And feel what they were feeling. Fear, helplessness, confusion, all of it came into Professor X at once, and let him experience what ordinary mutants live with. Beep. Beep. Too deep in their emotions, Professor X's power began climbing again without his meaning it to. And a red alarm went off, pulling him out of it. Ha! Professor X drew a breath and reeled the excess back in. The projection steadied. Under the amplifier, Professor X had been raised to the strength of a level 5 mutant. Now. It's time to recruit for the X-Men. Taking the helmet off, Professor X said it with real energy. So, what kind of abilities should we be looking for? He looked round at Brian and the others. Healing. X-ray vision. Magneto and Brian said it at the same moment. Magneto wanted a healer because of 7 days in a wheelchair. With a healer on the team, he wouldn't have spent 7 days in one at all. As for Brian, he chose X-ray vision. Because X-ray vision is, without question, the perfect complement to the Scylla template. Once Brian has it, he won't need to cut a brain open to take the ability inside it. X-ray vision is useless in a fight. For Brian, it is the single most important ability there is. X-ray vision isn't suited to combat. I'll set that aside for now. Professor X thought about it and turned Brian's suggestion down. Let's find a healer first. Does that work for you, Brian? Having weighed it up, Professor X judged that a healer would enormously improve the X-Men's survivability. That's fine. Brian nodded. A healing ability would be useful to have. If nothing else, you can treat the patient after opening his brain. Scylla opens the brain. Brian heals him. And then, even if Professor X grows suspicious, Brian has an answer. Scylla cut the brain open. What has that got to do with me, Brian? The direction of the first recruitment settled, Professor X put the helmet back on and began searching the world for a mutant who could heal. Haneda Airport, Tokyo, Japan. A flight from New York came slowly in to land. In first class, Brian's face was cold and he had not said a word. Beside him sat Magneto, still recovering, and Mystique, Raven. Raven, what's the matter with Brian? Magneto had never seen him like this. He looked over, puzzled. He has business with this country. Old business. He's angry. You do better not to prod him. Raven glanced at Brian and shook her head. That explains the mood since we reached Tokyo. Magneto let it go. An hour earlier. Professor X had swept the world with the brainwave amplifier and finally located 2 mutants with healing abilities. One in Tokyo. One in Egypt. Professor X intended to recruit both at once. He had originally assigned Brian to Egypt. Brian had no interest whatsoever in the Egyptian mutant. He turned the assignment down and attached himself firmly to the Tokyo team. While Magneto and Raven were talking, the aircraft door opened, and Brian went out ahead of everyone. He was not here to recruit Mayumi Yashida. He was here to kill. More precisely, Brian had come to Tokyo to kill a great many people, and had decided this before the aircraft landed. An airport staff member approached him about his conduct in the terminal. Brian raised one finger, and the man was thrown the length of the concourse into a waiting aircraft, dead before he landed. Come on. The Yashida family. Brian ignored the horrified faces around him, gave Magneto and Raven the instruction, and opened his right hand. In the car park, a convertible Mercedes tore free and came to him. He walked to the driver's door, threw the occupants clear with telekinesis, waited for Magneto and Raven to get in, and drove. Before leaving Haneda, Brian put several tornadoes into the terminal. They grew, and the airport came apart, and the people waiting there died in it. A pity I don't have Cyclops optic blasts. I could clear a much wider area. That would be satisfying. Brian said it while driving, with some regret. Neither Raven nor Magneto saw anything wrong in any of it. The Second World War had ended little more than 10 years earlier, and neither of them was inclined to spend sympathy here. Magneto. Tell me about the Yashida family. Brian asked it without taking his eyes off the road. The Yashida family was founded by Shiro Yashida, an officer during the Second World War. The story is that Shiro Yashida lived through the Nagasaki detonation personally and survived it by luck. Over the last 10 years, Shiro Yashida has assembled enormous wealth and power in Tokyo under the banner of Bushido. They are the most powerful conglomerate in the city. His son, Shingen Yashida, controls Tokyo's criminal networks, and has expanded the family considerably. And Mayumi Yashida is Shingen's wife. Magneto passed on what Professor X had given him. Brian nodded without comment. In fact, Brian's understanding of the Yashida family was considerably fuller than Magneto's. The Yashidas are the antagonists of the Wolverine. In 1945, Logan happened to be in Nagasaki, and during the detonation he saved a young officer. That officer was Shiro Yashida. Shiro Yashida watched a mutant survive a nuclear blast. And having been saved by Logan, he repaid it with treachery. In 2013 he faked his own death to draw Logan to Japan, and engineered the extraction of half of Logan's healing factor. Which is why the adamantium in Logan's body began to poison him, and why his regeneration failed by degrees. Logan saved a man who spent the rest of his life planning to gut him. Which is why, on learning the Yashida family existed, Brian had decided to destroy it. Half an hour later they reached the Yashida estate at the center of Tokyo. The family holds something close to 90% of Tokyo's wealth. The compound is enormous, not Xavier Manor, but perhaps a tenth of it. And today the place was busy. It was Shiro Yashida's 60th birthday. As the most powerful conglomerate in the country, the Yashidas had drawn something like half the senior figures in Japanese public life to celebrate it. At the gate, Brian looked coldly at the two Yakuza blocking his way. Who are you? One of them, heavily tattooed, demanded it. Baka. I asked you a question. He didn't finish. Brian closed his fist, and telekinesis crushed both men where they stood. Brian walked into the compound without hurrying. He had barely entered before several hundred security personnel surrounded him. Fully armed, and well equipped. Intruders. Kill them. One of them gave the order. Da-da-da. Dense gunfire. Brian ignored it entirely. Behind him, Magneto opened his right hand at exactly the right moment. Every round stopped dead. The bullets simply hung in the air. And then, under Magneto's control, all of them turned around. Brian, leave this to me. Go and find Mayumi Yashida. Brian raised a hand, and a stone lifted off the ground, became a streak of light, and went through the heads of the entire security detail at supersonic speed. It's yours, Magneto. That done, Brian nodded to him and went further in with Raven. You there, what do you think you're doing? A member of the household spotted them and challenged them. The answer was a stone traveling very fast. It went through his forehead. That made 42 members of the Yashida household Brian had killed. And he still hadn't located the family's core. Which was beginning to cost him his patience. Past a garden, Brian came upon a gathering of senior Tokyo politicians. They stared at him. One of them started to speak, and Brian, out of patience, attacked without waiting. He raised a hand and telekinesis tore the rocks out of the ground. They broke apart into countless splinters, and went through everyone present. Brian and Raven kept walking. Word of all this had long since reached the family's core. At that moment, in a nuclear-hardened meeting room beneath the Yashida assembly building, Shiro Yashida, 60 years old and already frail, looked at the surveillance feed his people had brought him. Watching Brian tear through the household with telekinesis, terror came into Shiro Yashida's eyes. A mutant. The same as Logan. They've come for me. Shiro Yashida shook and his face went white. He had seen a mutant walk out of a nuclear blast with his own eyes. That image had been waking him at night ever since. For years he had been afraid of Logan, and afraid of mutants generally. Afraid one would come for him. He knew exactly what he had done during the war. And it had kept him frightened his entire life. So seeing Brian's face on the screen, Shiro Yashida was reduced to something close to panic. Kill him. Kill him now. He screamed it. Watching his father come apart, Shingen Yashida frowned. He glanced at Mayumi Yashida beside him. Shingen was not especially afraid of mutants. On the contrary, Shingen wanted to be one. He wanted an ability of his own, and he wanted to use it to remove his father and take sole control of the family. And looking at Shiro Yashida in that state, he realized this was his opportunity. A chance to have someone else hold the knife. He gave one of his men a look. The man understood, and left the hall quickly. He found Brian, and threw a dart at his feet. Attached to it, the exact location of the hall where Shiro Yashida was hiding. Well. There's loyalty for you. Brian read the note and smiled without any warmth at all. Then he took Raven up and flew to the assembly building. Above it, he put out a hand and released telekinesis. The hall buried underneath was pulled straight out of the ground. Boom. He dropped it, hard, onto open ground. Then landed beside it and considered the thing. A slight movement of his right hand, and telekinesis stripped one wall away, revealing the core of the Yashida family inside. Don't kill me, please don't kill me. Shiro Yashida was frantic, begging. Brian raised his right hand without any expression at all. And Shiro Yashida's body flew into his palm. Please. Don't kill me. Brian smiled coldly, and released telekinesis at full strength, and began to crush him. Shiro Yashida screamed. Inside the building, Yashida family members came running out. Brian didn't look at them. They hit a telekinetic barrier like men walking into traffic, and were thrown backwards. Brian took half an hour over Shiro Yashida before finally killing him. Friend. You've killed Shiro Yashida. You can let the rest of us go now, surely. With his father dead, Shingen Yashida walked up to Brian and said it low. Let you go. Brian found it genuinely funny. He had come to Tokyo to kill people. And now Shingen Yashida wanted him to let everyone leave. Brian glanced at him, and then his eyes settled on a woman in the crowd with the bearing of a Yamato Nadeshiko. The moment he saw her, Brian knew she was his target. Mayumi Yashida. Brian smiled. He put out his right hand, and Mayumi Yashida was pulled out of the crowd and into his grip. Mayumi Yashida. You don't want me to kill the entire Yashida family, do you? Brian looked at her without the slightest restraint. Tokyo. The Yashida estate. The Yashida family may be the most powerful conglomerate in Tokyo. But set against a furious level 5 mutant. The Yashida family is paper. And Brian tore through it without effort. The whole estate was in a panic. Everyone was running. And as some of them reached the edge of the grounds, their heads were crushed by something unseen and burst. Watching family members come apart like dropped melons. The rest collapsed where they stood in terror. At the center of the estate, in front of the assembly hall, Brian looked at Mayumi Yashida with interest. His eyes lit up. He closed his right hand around her throat, and something like a smile appeared. Mayumi Yashida. I think you know what happens now. Brian let go of her, carelessly. Sir. Please, let me serve you. Mayumi Yashida looked back at her husband. And when Shingen Yashida nodded, she turned back to Brian and nodded obediently. Editor's note, Bridge. The source stages a 2-hour sex scene here. Mayumi is handed to Brian by her husband, under the standing threat that Brian will otherwise kill the entire family. She agrees only after Shingen nods. That is coercion, and I've kept the plot facts without writing the scene. Everything downstream, the 2 hours, her attempt to drain him afterwards, the life chamber, her death, is preserved below. 2 hours later, it was over. And Mayumi Yashida suddenly seized Brian's shoulders with both hands. Brian's expression didn't change. He felt his vitality beginning to drain out of him. An adaptive evolution triggered on the spot. In an instant his body had produced something new. His heart evolved an additional chamber. The chamber worked like a pump, it drew Brian's vitality in and sealed it away inside itself. Brian named it the life chamber. All of his vitality is stored there now. And as long as his heart is intact, none of it can be taken. Once the life chamber existed, adaptive evolution solidified it into his genes as an inscription. How? Why doesn't my ability work on you? Mayumi Yashida stared at him in astonishment. Her ability is life transfer. She can tell a healthy person from a sick one, draw the vitality out of the healthy, and pour it into the injured to heal wounds and illness. But to use it she has to touch a healthy person's skin with both hands and pull the vitality out through the contact. Since her ability awakened, it had never once failed. And now she couldn't extract anything from Brian at all. As though something had locked his vitality away out of reach. However hard Mayumi pushed, not a trace of it moved. Useless. Watching her fail, Shingen Yashida's face went very dark. Mayumi Yashida's ability is almost impossible to detect. Even his father, Shiro Yashida, had never noticed it, and had let Mayumi draw the vitality out of him for years, which is what aged him. And it was because of Mayumi's ability that Shingen had leaked Shiro's location in the first place, to have someone else hold the knife. After which Mayumi would drain Brian and finish him. He had not expected her ability to simply fail. So Shingen Yashida had now lost his wife and his gamble both. Under Brian's gaze, Shingen went down on his knees in front of him. I'll give you everything the Yashida family owns. I'm only asking you to let me leave. Brian was unmoved by any of it. He opened his right hand, and a terrifying weight of telekinesis came down on Shingen Yashida. His skin split at once. Within moments there was very little of him that wasn't blood. And it didn't end there. Brian kept increasing the pressure, and Shingen Yashida screamed. His muscle and bone came apart by degrees. And in front of everyone, Shingen Yashida died badly. Please, don't kill me. Watching the Yashida family's only heir die, the rest of them began begging. Brian answered the begging with a flick of his hand and a telekinetic shockwave. It went over all of them, and their bodies came apart into powder. In the whole of the assembly hall, only Mayumi Yashida was left. Raven. Go and tell Magneto. Brian glanced back at Raven, who had been waiting quietly behind him, and gave the instruction with a smile. All right, Brian. Raven nodded. She thinks of Brian as the only person who matters now, and does what he tells her. And she looked entirely certain that wiping out the Yashida family had been the obvious thing to do. It has to be said that Raven has, by this point, been remade in Brian's shape from the inside out. Once she had gone, Brian looked down at Mayumi Yashida, still struggling in his grip. Then slowly raised a finger. Business, now that the rest was out of his system. A small application of force, and an invisible blade opened Mayumi Yashida's forehead, and blood ran. She screamed. Under Brian's cold eyes, Mayumi Yashida's skull was opened. And she did not die of it immediately. The vitality she had absorbed took effect and began, slowly, to close the wound. Watching it heal, Brian moved his hand across and tore it open again. Then, over her screaming, Brian began looking for the circuit that carried her ability. There. A minute later Brian found it. And with it, her ability. Life transfer. Automaxed. He can draw the vitality out of anyone through skin contact and pour it into anyone else, healing injuries at speed. As long as the brain and the heart are undamaged. He can restore a body to its original condition instantly. But life transfer can only move vitality. It cannot store it for any length of time. Except that Brian had just evolved the solidified ability that does exactly that. The life chamber. Which lets him take vitality in, seal it away, and keep it. Having taken her ability, Brian threw out a telekinetic shockwave and reduced Mayumi Yashida to powder. Well. Another wasted trip. Behind him, Magneto sighed. Come on. I expect Professor X will have better news for us. Brian shrugged, walked over to him, and said it evenly. Magneto looked at the Yashida family Brian had slaughtered, and followed him out of the ruins. With the Yashida family destroyed, the events of the Wolverine will never happen. Which means Logan owes me a life. Brian walked through the streets of Tokyo, throwing tornadoes as he went. He looked at the enormous vortex tearing through the city. Satisfied, Brian took hold of Raven and Magneto, spread the four wings behind him, and climbed into the sky. New York. Xavier Manor. Brian came down out of the sky and landed in a textbook superhero stance. Above him, Raven and Magneto were set down gently by his telekinesis. And the moment he was back, Brian ran into Professor X. Professor X had a man in priest's robes with him. Brian. Magneto. Raven. You're back. Professor X frowned and glanced at Brian. He had already taken what happened in Japan out of Magneto's memory. He did not approve of what Brian had done. He also understood why Brian had done it. Which is why Professor X said very little about it. One family in Tokyo, destroyed. So it was destroyed. They had been on the wrong side of the war, after all. Brian, good timing. This is Father Asa. Also a mutant. Professor X introduced the X-Men's newest member. Father Asa, from Egypt. New gods, might I interest you in the word of our Egyptian lord? The ancient pharaoh, the sun god Ra, the god of gods. The gospel of the oldest god in the world. The god Apocalypse. Father Asa bowed slightly to them and moved into the sermon with practiced ease. Ah. Father Asa is a bishop of the Egyptian Apocalypse faith. Professor X explained it awkwardly. Father Asa had spent the entire journey extolling the glory of the Pharaoh Apocalypse, and Professor X had heard all of it. Bloody hell, Brian thought. Father Asa was a devout follower of the Egyptian Pharaoh Apocalypse. Professor X and the others might well file Apocalypse under Egyptian mythology. Brian knows perfectly well that the Apocalypse Father Asa worships is real. Apocalypse is currently sleeping in a hidden cave in Egypt, waiting for his followers to wake him. Brian had not imagined that the priest in front of him would turn out to be one of them. We are all new gods. And we should stand above the human world. The glory of the new gods will fall across the earth, and rewrite everything in it. Brian said it suddenly, with total seriousness. Which lit Father Asa up. New God, praise be to you. Your divine light will shine upon the world in time. Father Asa saluted him. As a member of the Apocalypse faith, Father Asa has never believed that they are mutants. They are gods, standing above humanity, and they should be raised up and restore the ancient order of ancient Egypt, in which gods ruled the world. In the conversation that followed, Brian learned what Father Asa's ability was. His blood heals. Drink it, and any injury can be undone. Within limits, of course. Simple external injuries take roughly 100 CCS. Serious injuries take varying amounts, depending on the damage. By Father Asa's own account, he can in theory bring back the dead. Provided he gives every drop of blood in his body. Father Asa calls his ability Divine Blood. Brian calls it a red potion. Father Asa then opened his palm, drew off 200 CCS, and handed it to Magneto. Charles, the god of the heart, tells me you've been injured. This will help you recover. Magneto blinked at it, and then couldn't take it fast enough. Father Asa's blood is nothing like an ordinary man's. It is clear and bright, like a ruby. Magneto drank all of it, and it dissolved in his mouth. A red glow closed over him, and his injuries healed fast enough to watch. Within a breath, Magneto was whole. Feeling a healthy body under him, Magneto's face filled with delight. Father Asa, your ability is remarkable. Magneto praised it sincerely. Father Asa looked a little pale, and accepted the praise without pretense. Father Asa, what did you just call Professor X? Raven, standing to one side, wasn't curious about the ability at all. She was curious about the titles. The God of the Heart. Father Asa said it gravely. And Magneto? The God of Metal. And Brian? The God of Evolution. So you're the God of Healing, and I'm the God of Shapeshifting? Raven pointed at herself, smiling. No. You I call the Lord God. Which shattered Magneto's composure entirely. Oh, come on. We're all gods and Raven gets to be the Lord God. Faced with the question, Father Asa looked at Raven's blue skin with real devotion. Because the Lord gods do not look like human beings. And Lady Raven has blue skin, as the sun god Ra does. In Egypt, blue is the color of nobility. She was born to be the Lord God, and to stand above the rest. That silenced Magneto. He let go of Father Asa's theology of gods and Lord gods entirely. And turned to Professor X. Professor X. We now have a member with healing abilities, which secures us. But if we're going to fight Shaw's Hellfire Club, we clearly need more mutants than this. Magneto had his health back. Several days of serious injury had left him feeling stifled. And he wanted to be doing something. Agreed. We need more. Professor X nodded, and led all of them back to the X chamber. Apocalypse, this is a holy instrument. Seeing the brainwave amplifier for the first time and learning what it did, Father Asa was astonished. Father Asa. Quietly, please. Professor X reminded him gently. With every new member, Professor X was becoming more of a leader. He put the helmet on, and the amplifier came alive at once. The red mutant projections filled the X chamber again. It wasn't the first time Brian had seen them. Seeing them again still made him envious. If the abilities of all those tens of thousands of mutants were taken, Brian would go straight past Apocalypse and become the actual god of mutant kind. For the moment, though, that stayed a thought. A minute later, Professor X took the helmet off. I've found 5. And he read out the details of the 5 he'd selected. Brian looked over them and his mouth twitched. He knew 4 of the 5. One was Angel Salvador, who joins the X-Men and then defects to the Hellfire Club. One was Banshee, Sean Cassidy, who is written out almost as soon as he appears, and whose abilities are used appallingly badly. One was Havoc, Alex, who turns up a great many times later. And one was Logan. Wolverine. There should have been a 5th name here, Darwin. But Brian had opened Darwin's skull a long time ago. Which is why the 5th mutant was someone Brian had never heard of. Tomorrow, Magneto and I will recruit all 5. Professor X glanced at Brian, and this time did not send him out recruiting. Brian looked back at him, and there was a good deal in the look. Clearly, Professor X was worried he would lose control the way he had in Japan. All right. Brian accepted it. He had already memorized every detail on all 5 mutants. He had originally been planning to invent a reason not to go on the recruitment drive at all, so that he could reach them first, and open their skulls. Since taking Mayumi Yashida's life transfer, Brian was no longer worried about the skull cutting being discovered. So being excluded from the recruitment suited him perfectly. Right. Everyone rest. Brian, take Father Asa and find him a room. Professor X gave the instruction. Brian smiled sincerely and turned to him. God of healing. This way, please. Brian took Father Asa to a room. Thank you, Brian, God of evolution. I am very pleased with this room. Father Asa looked around it. The 18th century European decoration suited a priest very well. And just as Father Asa turned to say goodnight, he was struck on the back of the head. He didn't have time to make a sound before he went down, looking at him unconscious on the floor. Brian shut the door, and spread telekinesis across the whole of Xavier Manor. Once he was satisfied Professor X's attention was elsewhere, Brian extended his right index finger and began the work with practiced ease. Swish. The dull sound of tissue parting. It carried about a meter before it met an invisible barrier and stopped. Long before he started, Brian had raised a telekinetic barrier and sealed the room. Nothing inside it gets out. As Brian worked, a line of blood as red as ruby ran from Father Asa's forehead. Brian caught it with telekinesis and collected it. It was a red potion. He wasn't going to waste it. A few minutes later, Brian stood up from Father Asa's head. He had Father Asa's divine blood. The blood in his own body turned as bright as a ruby, and gave off a faint light. And the Scylla template had taken divine blood to maximum. The healing power of his blood is now enormous. Father Asa needs a great deal of blood to heal someone else's injuries. Brian needs a single drop to put flesh back on bone. Set against Father Asa's, Brian's blood genuinely earns the name. But powerful as it is, divine blood has one flaw. Divine blood cannot heal its owner. For Father Asa and for Brian both, their blood is simply blood. Injure the body and the ability does nothing for it. Even seeing through the operating laws of all things cannot fix that. Brian cut his own finger with telekinesis, and let a drop fall into Father Asa's mouth. Nothing happened at all. The two abilities share an origin. Brian's version is far stronger. It still has no effect on the man he took it from. Life transfer it is, then. Brian shrugged, and put his right hand on Father Asa's shoulder. Life transfer. He triggered it, and the vitality stored in the life chamber ran into Father Asa like water. And as it went in, the wound across his forehead began closing fast enough to watch. Within moments the open skull had sealed. Beyond a shallow scar, Father Asa was entirely restored. And that scar, at a glance, would pass for a crease in the skin. Now seal Father Asa's memory away, and we're finished. Brian pressed his right hand to the man's forehead and released Mind Seal. His consciousness found the memory at once, and buried it in the depths of Father Asa's mind. When he wakes, Father Asa won't remember losing any time at all. Sleep well, Father. Brian lifted him onto the bed with telekinesis, and considerately pulled the covers over him. Then took a last look at him and left the room. He glanced at the darkening sky outside. His mood was excellent. As the saying goes, a dark night and a high wind make good weather for killing. Brian intended to wait until Professor X and the others were asleep, and then work down the list under cover of night. But before that, Brian went back to his own room, where Raven had been waiting for some time, wearing an angel's shape. Raven, sweetheart. I'm here. Midnight, and the whole of New York had gone dark. Only the night venues were still lit. And above the city, a figure in a black robe with its face hidden inside the hood flew fast. The figure was Brian. Raven had kept him 3 hours. Professor X and the others had finally gone to sleep. And once Raven was asleep too, Brian left Xavier Manor quietly. On the way out he passed a shop and helped himself to a black robe. His first target was Banshee. Sean Cassidy. As for why not Angel? As Brian put it, Angel's ability is simply too weak. Insect wings and spitting acid is, frankly, rubbish. So Brian passed over Angel and started with the young mutant who uses Banshee's power so badly. At present, Brian was at the New York Aquarium. By Professor X's file, Sean Cassidy works here. The aquarium closes at night. Only scattered lights were still on over the tanks. In front of one of them, a young man was tapping the glass, looking pleased with himself. As he tapped, fish gathered to him. The young man was Brian's target. Banshee. Sean Cassidy. Catherine. That's impressive, isn't it? Sean Cassidy turned and winked at the girl beside him. What exactly is impressive about it? The girl called Catherine asked it flatly. You like fish. I like fish. Perhaps we should find an evening and have a proper talk about it. Sean Cassidy's technique with women is well practiced, and has clearly worked on a great many of them. I'd sooner date a fish than spend an evening talking to you, Sean. Catherine turned him down without mercy and walked off. Sean Cassidy frowned slightly, then turned and sent a burst of infrasound, inaudible to humans, into the tank. The fish scattered and were gone in an instant. Catherine, look. There's only me left now. He called after her. Catherine turned back and saw an empty tank. Not a fish in it. What a tedious trick. Catherine looked at him with contempt and made to leave. Sean Cassidy. A low voice came out of the aquarium, and both of them froze. Then they saw a figure with its face hidden inside a black hood. What the, who are you? How did you get in here? Sean Cassidy frowned at the man in the black robe and demanded it. The man in the robe was, of course, Brian. And Brian ignored him entirely. He is a level 5 mutant. Was he going to concern himself with a level 1 who can't use his own power? Brian opened his right hand, and Catherine's body flew into his arms without any say in the matter. Catherine was startled to lose control of herself. And then she saw Brian's face. Well. Sir, perhaps we could have dinner. Or something better than dinner. Catherine's eyes lit up, and she propositioned him charmingly. Oh, come on. Catherine, you. Sean Cassidy stared at the scene in front of him. Being NTR'd in his own aquarium sent Sean Cassidy into a fury. He looked at Brian, and then charged him regardless. Brian? Brian looked at him with open contempt. You're a mutant, and instead of using your ability you're coming at me with your fists. Brian simply waved a hand, and Sean Cassidy flew backwards into a fish tank. Cough, you're a mutant. Sean Cassidy worked it out. Fine. If you're a mutant too, don't blame me for using mine. He got up painfully, drew a deep breath, and screamed. The sound came out in visible rings of compressed air and struck at Brian. The tank behind him shattered instantly. Brian did nothing at all. An invisible telekinetic barrier stopped every bit of it. Damn it, how? Sean Cassidy's eyes went wide. His ability is to produce sound waves of every kind through his throat. He'd tested it. It shatters glass without difficulty. And it did nothing whatsoever to the man in the black robe. You could have been this world's Black Bolt. You could melt the flesh off a man with a single sentence. And you use it to break glass. Brian said it with real derision. Strictly speaking, Sean Cassidy's ability is excellent. He can generate sound in any form. And release it as pure energy. Which makes it very close to Black Bolt's power. Sean Cassidy can produce low-frequency infrasound that resonates with human organs and ruptures them outright, killing a man with one sentence. He can shatter solids with resonant frequencies. And Sean Cassidy uses it for low-altitude flight and echolocation. There are no rubbish abilities. Only rubbish people. And Sean Cassidy is a rubbish person. It's mine now, in any case. Brian wasted no more time. He pulled Sean Cassidy over with telekinesis. Then, under the man's horrified eyes, raised his index finger, and a fine edge of telekinesis opened his forehead. Sean Cassidy screamed. The sound of it broke every tank in the room. Brian was entirely unaffected. And through the screaming, Brian opened his skull. The pain put Sean Cassidy under. A minute later, Brian stood up. He had taken the ability to generate sound out of Sean Cassidy's brain. And with seeing through the operating laws of all things optimizing it. Brian's version came out at maximum. The energy in the sound he produces carries for tens of kilometers. He can generate ultrasound and infrasound at any frequency. He can make a man burst with a single word, exactly as Black Bolt does. And he can compress sound into a line and carry his voice for miles. Brian is now a copy of Black Bolt. The only difference is scale. Level 5 sound cannot annihilate the human race the way Black Bolt can. And Sean Cassidy's ability only generates sound. It cannot receive it, still less build an image from it in the mind. Which killed Brian's hope of scanning brains with ultrasound and taking abilities the easy way. One other drawback. You'll never get to meet Wanda now. Brian shrugged and looked down at the dying man. Then he opened his index finger, and a drop of clear divine blood went into Sean Cassidy's mouth. Buzz. As the blood went down, red light closed over him, and the wound across his forehead sealed fast enough to watch. Within a blink he was whole. That is the blood ability Brian took from Father Asa. Divine blood. One drop closes any injury. Brian looked at the result, nodded, satisfied, and put his right hand on Sean Cassidy's forehead. Mind seal. He deleted everything that had just happened. Then did the same to Catherine, and left the aquarium. It seems the skull cutting stays until I get X-ray vision. Brian sighed as he walked out. Half an hour later he reached Manhattan. Where there was a mutant Brian was extremely interested in. In a room there. A man had been sleeping soundly. And then every hair on his body stood up and his eyes snapped open. His danger sense had just started screaming at him. The air around him felt saturated with warning, and every part of him wanted to be somewhere else. He came off the bed and ran for the door. And as he reached it, the warning spiked again, and the door in front of him registered as something that would swallow him whole. He threw himself sideways without stopping to think. Bang! The instant he was clear, the solid door tore backwards off its frame and hit the far wall. And Brian was standing in the opening. Danger! 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 Looking at Brian, the man's scalp crawled and every hair stood up, and the warning drove his heart into his throat. Everything about Brian read as lethal. And worse than that. With Brian in the room, the entire world registered as danger. There was nowhere the warning said he could go. What do you want? He was terrified. The danger sense was close to suffocating him. Brian didn't answer. He was in a hurry. He pinned the man in place with telekinesis and opened his skull from across the room. A minute later, Brian had the ability. Danger prediction. Early warning of danger. That's Spider-Man's. Danger prediction has no tears. It is a spontaneous warning mechanism of the body. With it, any time Brian is in danger, the sense will fire and let him recognize the threat and avoid it in advance. Though unlike Peter's, danger prediction won't move the body for him. This one's not much use to me, honestly. Brian rubbed his chin. He already has adaptive evolution. The more dangerous a situation, the stronger he gets. And danger prediction exists to keep him out of danger. Which does rather defeat the point. Although, danger prediction is passive. Which means even if I wipe his memory, the sense will still register what I am. To him, and to mutants generally. Brian looked down at the unconscious man. Now that he had the ability, he understood he couldn't leave this one alive. Because the ability is passive. If the man joined the X-Men, it would fire every time he saw Brian. Brian, who takes abilities, registers as a threat to every mutant alive. And Brian did not want Professor X noticing that one of his people set off a permanent alarm around him. So the safe answer was to kill him. Goodbye. Brian opened his mouth and released a sound wave. It rolled over the man on the floor, and his body began to shake beyond any control. Bang! And came apart into pulp. Sound really is convenient. Brian was very satisfied with the destructive power of it. He now needs about 2/10 of a word to shatter a man's bones and organs and reduce him to pulp. Next. Havoc. Alex. Brian left Manhattan for the NYPD building. Where Alex had asked to be imprisoned. Whoosh. Brian whistled. And the sound spread through the entire building. Low-frequency infrasound put everyone inside it on the floor unconscious. Brian walked into the NYPD and found Alex's cell. Looking at the heavy door, Brian waved a hand, and it tore out of its frame and was set aside. Who are you? Behind it, a young man stared at him blankly. You can call me Scylla. Brian spoke, and the force of the sound put Alex on the floor in pain. Swish. And through Alex's wailing, Brian opened his skull. By the time Brian left the police station, he had Alex's ability. Energy shockwave. Automaxed. Alex can't control his own power, and can't focus it to a single point. Brian has no such problem. He can release an energy shockwave from any part of his body. For enormous damage. Night, on the streets of New York. Brian walked quietly through the dark. The darkness had let him adapt night vision, his eyes gave off a faint light, and everything around him was as clear as daylight. Buzz. And walking, every hair on Brian stood up. The air behind him had begun putting out warnings. Brian's danger prediction was firing. Brian turned to look. And found 2 men behind him with revolvers pointed at his back. Hey. Friend. Hand over the money. One of them said it, having seen Brian turn round. You know what this is, friend? This is a gun. The other lifted his revolver, spun it twice for effect, and leveled it again. And this counts as danger? Brian frowned slightly. Danger prediction really doesn't suit him. So Brian switched it off. Danger prediction is passive, but it can be shut down. And once it's off, it stops warning him about anything. Hey. Kid. We're talking to you. Seeing himself ignored entirely, one of them took offense and reached out to put the muzzle against Brian's head. Boom. Brian raised one finger without much interest, concentric rings gathered at the tip of it, and a red energy shockwave about the thickness of a thumb came out. It went straight through the man who had been talking. And the high temperature of it charred the wound black. Bang. His eyes went wide and he dropped where he stood. What the hell are you? The other one screamed and went to pull his trigger. And however hard he pulled, the trigger did not move at all. Then, under his horrified eyes, the revolver slid out of his hand, turned around, and pointed itself at him. Bang. 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 Brian emptied the magazine into him. With Alex's ability, Brian can release energy shockwaves at will. He can set their scale however he likes. And fire them from any part of his body. A level 5 energy shockwave is more than 10 times the yield of a medium-range missile. One of them will take down a skyscraper without difficulty. Next. Time to meet Wolverine. In 1962, Logan has not yet been given his adamantium. He is still down to bone claws, which makes Logan a fairly weak level 3 mutant at present. Even his half-brother, Sabretooth, Victor, can beat him. It is only after 1979 that Logan becomes Wolverine properly. By the intelligence Professor X pulled from the brainwave amplifier, Logan is currently in a bar called Eller. Telekinesis lifted Brian into the air, ready to go and perform some surgery on Logan. And just as he was about to move, he stopped. Because he had just taken a telepathic message from Professor X. Brian. Hank is in trouble. Brian frowned slightly. Professor X didn't know Brian had left the manor. He had simply broadcast to every X-Man and closed the link. Hanging in the air, Brian looked toward the Eller with real regret. So much for tonight's hunting. With Hank in trouble, Brian had to stop, or Professor X would start wondering where he was. He wasn't especially bothered. Logan isn't going anywhere. As long as he hasn't got the adamantium yet, Brian can still open his skull and take the healing factor. Boom. For white wings extended behind him. And he flew for Xavier Manor. A minute later Brian was back. And ran into Raven the moment he arrived. Raven, what's happened? Brian went to her and asked it low. I don't know. I heard Hank scream. Then Professor X told us all Hank was in trouble. Raven shook her head. She had only just woken up and knew nothing. Come on. Let's get to his room. Brian nodded and took Raven with him. Outside Hank's room, Professor X, Magneto and Father Asa were already gathered. Professor X was frowning at the closed door. Professor X. What's wrong with Hank? Brian arrived, glanced at the door, and asked. Let's talk inside. Professor X sighed at the sight of Brian and Raven, and nodded to Magneto. Magneto raised a hand, and the lock opened. Brian went in first. And the X-Men found the room thoroughly wrecked. Hank had converted it into a laboratory some time ago. Now every instrument in it was overturned, experimental data was scattered across the floor, the sofa was in several pieces, and the tables and chairs had been taken apart. Everyone frowned at it. Hank. Come out. Every eye went to Professor X. He put his right hand to his temple, using his power to steady Hank's emotions continuously. And as he spoke, a blue-furred gorilla 2.5 meters tall came out of the corner of the room. Looking at it, Brian understood immediately. Hank had finally become Beast. Hello. I'm Hank. The blue gorilla pushed his glasses up his nose and said it with a grimace. You're Hank. How did this happen? Raven looked at him in astonishment. Remember when I took a tube of your blood, Raven? Hank looked at her bitterly. A few days earlier, having finished the brainwave amplifier, Hank had gone to Raven and asked her for blood. And extracted a particular compound from it, which showed Hank a route to becoming an ordinary person. So Hank built a mutant gene inhibitor. And when Hank injected the inhibitor into himself, instead of turning him ordinary, it turned him into this. There were errors in my work. The shape-shifting genetic material I put into the inhibitor didn't suppress my mutant gene. It stimulated it. Hank said it helplessly. Hank, this body suits you rather well. Magneto said it seriously. Roar. And was answered with a roar. As it came out of him, the claws on both of Hank's hands extended fast. And every muscle locked. He had plainly taken the remark as mockery, and it had enraged him. Calm down, Hank. Seeing Beast about to spring, Brian raised a hand and bound him with telekinesis. Roar, let me go. Brian, let me go. Beast roared and fought against it. His blue fur bristled like a hedgehog's spines, and the muscle swelled. The 2.5 meters of him expanded further. His body was iron and his frame was copper, and there was violent animal strength packed into it. Crack. Crack. The floor under him gave way, and both long, furred feet sank into it. A man who breaks flagstones by standing on them is not weak. And however hard Beast fought, he could not get out of the telekinesis. Get off. Beast swore at him, teeth bared. Which turned Brian, who had only been restraining him, distinctly cold. Boom. Brian waved a hand, and Beast was hit as though by an express train and thrown clean across the room. His body went into the wall, and the force of it brought the wall down. Beast was buried under the rubble. Brian. That was too hard. Professor X frowned slightly. Don't worry, Professor X, Hank's rather thick-skinned now. Brian looked at the ruined wall and said it evenly. Roar. A roar came out from underneath. Beast heaved the slab off himself and came out of the rubble. And beyond his blue fur being filthy, he was entirely unharmed. Clearly, becoming Beast had improved his strength, resilience and speed by an enormous degree. Brian. I'm going to kill you. Beast came out of the rubble with his eyes going red, thoroughly enraged. Bang. He dropped onto all fours like a genuine animal, drove off all 4 limbs, and came at Brian fast. Reaching him, he leapt, and brought both fists down like a hammer from above. Hank, you really aren't built for fighting. Even as a beast. Watching him swing like a gorilla, Brian simply slapped him out of the air and knocked him back again. And when Beast got up, there was fear in the way he looked at Brian. Under everyone's eyes, Beast turned, dropped onto all fours, and ran. Professor X, Hanks bolted. Magneto watched him go and said it. Professor X nodded and put his right hand to his temple. And used his power to bring Beast's scrambled consciousness back. Mid-sprint, Beast stopped. He looked down at his own hands, and stood up. I'm sorry, Brian. The serum has my head confused. Beast came back over and apologized, contrite. He had used the serum to activate the mutant gene in himself. Which took him from a level 1 mutant to a level 4, past Magneto. And activated his animal instincts along with it. Those instincts had left Beast's mind muddled, volatile and impulsive. Nothing like the Hank of a day ago. Thank you, Professor X. Beast turned and thanked him sincerely. Professor X had used his power to suppress the animal instincts and restore his mind. His head is clear now. And his emotions are stable. Even as a beast, Hank can feel that he has become smarter. A great many problems that were murky before are now perfectly simple. Hank. Congratulations on level 4. Professor X said it smiling. Hank had always had a first-class mind, and very little combat capability. That has changed. As a level 4 beast, Hank now has an extraordinary intellect, enormous strength, great speed, and an animal's instincts. All right, Hank. Go and get used to that body. Brian patted his shoulder and said it in earnest. All right, Brian. Beast nodded. Energetic as he felt, he had only just become a level 4, and needed time to learn himself. Satisfied Hank had no other problems, Professor X and the others went back to their rooms. Brian and Raven did the same. Because of Hank, Brian gave up on hunting Logan. Nothing else happened that night. And when the next morning came, Professor X and Magneto set out to recruit. With Banshee, Havoc and the others joining. The decisive fight with the Hellfire Club is not far off. New York. Inside a strip club. Professor X and Magneto watched a dancer with some interest. During the interval, Professor X took a stack of notes out of his pocket and handed it to Angel Salvador, still working as a dancer. You can put this towards the private room. Angel smiled at him. She led Professor X and Magneto through to a private room. For two of you, the fee is double. Professor X and Magneto looked at her, and then Magneto snapped his fingers. The metal tray in front of him lifted into the air. You're mutants. Angel looked at Professor X in surprise. The recruitment went without a hitch. It took an hour for Professor X to bring Angel back to Xavier Manor. Brian, this is Angel Salvador. Show her round. Professor X gave the instruction. He is increasingly in the habit of instructing rather than asking. Come on, Angel. Let's find you a suitable room. Brian nodded and took her off to one. Brian, what's your ability? Angel asked it as soon as they were inside. Very simple. I can adapt to any woman. Brian answered without much ceremony. Really? Can I test that? Angel's eyes lit up at the answer, and she propositioned him directly. Brian obliged. 2 hours later, not long after Brian came out of Angel's room, Professor X and Magneto returned with Sean Cassidy, Banshee. Having handed Banshee over to Brian, Professor X left again immediately for the NYPD. They still had to collect Havoc. Hello. You must be Homelander. Brian. I'm Sean Cassidy. Mystique gave me a code name. Banshee. Once Professor X had gone, Sean came over and introduced himself, smiling. Hello, Banshee. Welcome to the X-Men. Brian patted his shoulder gently. Looking at him, Sean relaxed. He'd assumed this Homelander would be difficult. And Brian seemed thoroughly pleasant. Though for some reason, standing in front of Brian, Sean's forehead began to sting faintly. He scratched at it with a finger and decided he hadn't slept properly. Banshee, go and pick a room. You'll be living and training here from now on. Brian exchanged a few more words with him and sent him off. Is there another new god? Once Sean had gone, Father Asa came over to Brian. As he spoke, he touched the faint horizontal line across the middle of his forehead. Father Asa had woken to find it there. Father Asa, what's happened to your forehead? Brian looked at what he was doing and asked, knowing the answer perfectly well. Age, I'm afraid. Age. The lines have started arriving. Father Asa said it with a sigh. He had assumed all along that the line was a wrinkle. It had not occurred to him that someone had opened his skull. Father Asa should rest more. The body can't sustain that frequency of blood loss. Brian offered the advice in earnest. Father Asa agreed. His ability requires him to bleed himself regularly to treat other people. Which leaves the body weak. Aging quickly follows naturally enough. Thank you, Brian, God of Evolution. May the light of Ra, the Sun God, rest upon you always. Father Asa said it sincerely. Father Asa. Tell me about Apocalypse, the first pharaoh of Egypt. I find his story very interesting. And with that, the two of them went through to a reception room. Hearing that Brian wanted to know about the ancient god, Father Asa began, and did not stop. Apocalypse was born in the first dynasty of Egypt. He is the oldest and the most powerful of the gods. He used his power to establish the age of divine rule. And governed humanity for thousands of years by supreme divine authority. Until one day, when Apocalypse went to his pyramid to prepare for the transference, a body of humans who resented his rule rose against him. The transference is the one moment at which Apocalypse is weak. And the humans succeeded. They destroyed his pyramid. They claimed to have killed him. And from that point the world entered the age of men. Father Asa recounted it devoutly. And when he came to the betrayal, his voice was full of anger. But we have always believed that Apocalypse is not dead. He was merely sealed somewhere beneath the earth of Egypt by the rebels. The Apocalypse faith has been searching for him ever since. Having said it, Father Asa bowed toward Egypt. Brian watched him without saying anything. Father Asa was right. Apocalypse is not dead. He is sleeping somewhere beneath Egypt, waiting for his followers to dig him out. At which point he will rise, and the events of X-Men, Apocalypse will play out. Though it is too early to be thinking about that. Because it will be more than 10 years before Apocalypse wakes. Which gives Brian plenty of time to grow. While Brian was talking with Father Asa, Professor X and Magneto reached the gates of the NYPD. And the moment they arrived, Professor X's face changed. "What is it, Charles?" Magneto looked at him, puzzled. "My telepathy isn't picking up a single mind. Something has happened here." Professor X said it grimly. Magneto stopped short, and the two of them went in together. And found New York police officers lying across the floor. "They're alive." Magneto checked them over with some competence and, finding them breathing, told Professor X what happened here. He stood up and looked around at all of them, thoroughly lost. "Have a look and we'll know." Professor X went to one of the officers and put his right hand on his head. His power went into the man's mind and read the memory. And Professor X's face turned very serious. He stood and said to Magneto, "The NYPD was attacked by a mutant." He said it with complete certainty. In the officer's memory, the man never saw the attacker. But he heard a whistle that made his head swim. And with that whistle, several hundred officers went down without a single exception. Which is enough to establish a mutant. And a powerful one. A mutant attack. Was it the Hellfire Club? Magneto went to them first. "I don't know. Whoever it was, it isn't good news for us." Professor X shook his head. He knew perfectly well that the attacker might be level 4. And a hidden level 4 mutant is very bad news for the X-Men. Alex. Professor X thought of it suddenly and ran for the cells. And found the metal door thrown aside. His pupils contracted. The mutant's target had plainly been Havoc. Professor X reached Alex quickly, and finding his breathing steady, let out a breath. Then put his right hand to Alex's forehead and read him. "Well, Charles, what did they want?" Magneto asked it. Alex lost consciousness at the whistle. He has no idea what happened. Professor X sighed. Alex's memory gave him nothing. But he was becoming certain that somebody had marked the X-Men. "We need to move. The mutant with the danger sense may well have been attacked too." Professor X said it gravely. Then glanced at the unconscious Alex and sent a message to Brian at the manor. "Brian. Come to the NYPD." Brian, still talking with Father Asa, stood up at it. Then took off, spread the 4 wings behind him, and flew out of Xavier Manor. A few minutes later he came down in the NYPD's forecourt. Where Professor X and Magneto were waiting. "Professor X, what's happened?" Brian looked at Alex, laid out on the iron door behind Magneto, and asked seriously. "The NYPD was attacked. We think the Hellfire Club did it. They may have marked us. The mutant with the danger sense may be in danger. We need to get there." Professor X gave him the short version, and Magneto waved a hand, the iron door lifted and carried Alex over to Brian. "Brian, take Alex back for us." Professor X said it and left in a hurry. Brian watched the two of them go, and smiled to himself. Then Brian whistled. Bang! Red mist formed, and Azazel appeared in front of him. "Azazel. What's Shaw doing?" Brian asked it first. "Shaw has recruited another level 4. Enhanced hearing." Azazel produced a dagger and started trimming his nails. "Enhanced hearing?" Brian sounded surprised. "Yes. This one can hear any sound in the whole of New York without effort." Azazel nodded and gave up what he had on the Hellfire Club's newest member. "Understood. Shaw's been trying to find the X-Men, hasn't he? Tell him. They're at Xavier Manor, in New York. Brian said it, then spread his wings and carried Alex back to the manor with telekinesis. He gave away the X-Men's location because he wanted them to feel what the Hellfire Club can do. So that Professor X keeps hunting abilities on his behalf. And so that Professor X and Magneto are forced to grow. At present, Professor X is only a level 4 psychic without the amplifier. And Magneto is weaker still, a level 3, even now. At their current strength, never mind killing Shaw. It would be an achievement to survive him. Which is not a situation Brian is prepared to accept. Because he still needs Professor X and Magneto to kill Shaw for him, so that he can take Shaw's Omega level ability. So he wants them to grow. And a bloody lesson is the fastest and best teacher there is. Not long after Brian got back to Xavier Manor, Professor X and Magneto reached the home of the mutant with the danger sense. And the moment he was through the door, Professor X saw what was left in the living room. Professor X, who had never seen anything like it, was sick. The Hellfire Club is picking us off. Magneto's face went very dark. Pale, Professor X nodded in agreement. If it had only been Alex, it might have been coincidence. This man's death made it clear the X-Men were being hunted. And there is only one group with a grievance against the X-Men. It was the Hellfire Club. There was no question about it. Charles. What do we do? Magneto looked to him for a decision. We go to the last one. Professor X turned and left. Then put his right hand to his temple and said to Magneto. And call Brian. Brian is the only one of us who can fight Shaw. That said, he passed his decision to Brian telepathically. I'm going along to recruit Logan. So I get to see the famous scene after all. Brian was thoroughly delighted, and extremely interested in recruiting Wolverine. New York. The Eller Tavern. A very old bar. It has stood since the 18th century. And the whole place is thick with history. Brian and the other two arrived at it. Coming in, they found a wall of photographs. They record the changing of the times from 1845 to 1962. Brian went over with some interest and picked one up. It showed a grand estate. On the lawn, the owner of the house stood smiling with his arm round his wife and his small son. And in the corner of the frame, a bearded gardener held a little boy with sharp nails, and watched in silence. Along the bottom of the photograph, a line of text. Taken August 1845. Congratulations to the youngest son of the Howlett family, James Howlett, on his 8th birthday. Interested in that one, sir? The old landlord came over, looked at the photograph in Brian's hand, and something wistful crossed his face. My grandfather told me the story of the Howletts when I was small. They say the Howletts were extremely wealthy once. John Howlett, who owned the estate, was a kind man. He was always finding work for the poor. But the good die young, as they say. When John's youngest son James was 8, everything about the Howlett family changed. Thomas Logan, their gardener, killed John Howlett while drunk. And then killed himself rather than face justice. John's wife, Elizabeth Howlett, lost her mind from the shock of it, talking about monsters and mutants all day long. And James Howlett, the youngest son, was never found. That was the end of the Howletts. The landlord shook his head and sighed. George. Enough of your Howlett story. Just as the landlord was properly warming to it, a distinctly impatient voice cut across him. Brian looked toward it and saw a familiar figure at once. Logan. Not yet Wolverine, dressed like something out of a western, a Cuban cigar in his mouth and dog tags at his throat, working through one beer after another. All right, Logan. Still no interest in history, I see. George the landlord shrugged and went back behind the bar. Can I get you something, sir? He asked Brian. A brandy, thank you. Professor X had reached the bar before Brian could answer. "Of course, sir." George smiled and poured it for him. "And a beer for Mr. Logan, if you would." Professor X said it, then turned to Brian. "Brian, I haven't located the Hellfire Club's mutant yet. Don't relax on my account. You keep watch. Magneto and I will invite Mr. Logan." Brian nodded at the arrangement, smiling. "Professor X. This prophecy comic is for you." Brian took one out of his pocket, drawn hastily before they came to fetch Logan, and handed it over. A prophecy comic? Darwin foresaw this moment. Professor X looked at it, puzzled. It has a single panel, which shows Logan with Professor X and Magneto beside him, and 3 speech bubbles above their heads. "Hello, I'm Professor X, hello, I'm Magneto. Go fuck yourself." Professor X frowned at it, then looked over at Logan, and walked toward him with some disbelief. Brian put out a hand, and a brandy came off the back of the bar into it. He raised the glass, smiling, and settled in to watch. Brian had been looking forward to this scene very much. Under his eye, Professor X and Magneto reached Logan. Logan, drinking, watched the pair of them approach, ignored them entirely, picked his cigar up off the table and started smoking. "Hello, Logan. I'm Professor X. Charles Xavier." "Hello, Logan. I'm Magneto." Both of them introduced themselves smiling. And Professor X made his offer. "Logan, we'd like to invite you." He didn't finish. Logan cut across him without any manners at all. "Go fuck yourself." Professor X and Magneto's faces froze. And Brian, watching from the side, looked at the pained expressions on both of them and laughed, rather unkindly. Which made their faces darker still. Professor X's especially. He had assumed until this moment that the scene in the comic simply would not happen. And had now been proved wrong to his face. Which cracked his composure a little. "Logan, we're all mutants. We ought to help one another." Professor X was still trying, and doing his best to talk Logan into the X-Men. And in reply, Logan raised his right hand. SHK. A pale bone claw shot out between his knuckles and went straight into Professor X's neck. The claw opened his skin. Blood everywhere. "Damn it, Charles." Seeing him attacked, Magneto released his ability at once. The knives and forks on the table were in front of Logan's eyes instantly. Logan looked at the cutlery hanging inches from him and was entirely unmoved. A century of fighting had long since made him indifferent to physical pain. And just as the 3 of them were about to go at it properly, Brian, watching from the side, raised a hand. Boom. Telekinesis blew Logan clean out of the tavern. Roar. Out on the street, Logan was thoroughly enraged. He roared in a manner that would become extremely familiar, and the claws came out. Brian found the sight of those bone claws faintly unpleasant. He waved a hand, and telekinesis snapped every one of them. "Logan, your claws are very fragile." Crack. Crack. The sound of bone breaking, and Logan's muscles locked in pain, and every vein in him stood out. He didn't make a sound. He came at Brian like a wounded animal instead. And as he came, the broken claws were already healing, and within moments were whole again. Logan reached him, set his fists, swung, and drove the claws at Brian at speed. Brian simply waved a hand. The attacking arm was pinned in place by invisible telekinesis. The claws stopped a few centimeters short of Brian's throat. And however hard Logan pushed, the arm would not move another inch. Brian turned his fingers downward. Logan's arms crossed against his will, and the claws went into both of his own kidneys. That, Logan could not take in silence. He grunted and pulled the claws straight back out. And his organs and the flesh around them closed rapidly. Watching the speed of it, Brian was full of admiration. It has to be said that Logan's healing factor is an Omega-level ability in its own right. In theory, as long as his head stays on, Logan lives forever. And a healing factor like that was extracted from him by Shiro Yashida in the Wolverine. Which is frankly an insult to the ability. Though Shiro Yashida is dead now, killed by Brian. So the events of the Wolverine will never happen. Healed, Logan wanted to keep going. But telekinesis pinned him spread-eagled, and he could not move at all. "Who are you?" Logan shouted it at him. "Remember the name, Logan." "I'm Homelander." "Brian." Brian looked at him roaring and gave a small laugh. "Homelander? Brian?" Logan looked at him for a long moment, and filed the name away. "All right, Brian. We should go." Behind him, Professor X looked at Logan. And then said it. Professor X had no resentment about being refused. Any mutant with justice in mind may join the X-Men. And any mutant may refuse. That is their right. Since Logan didn't want to join, there was nothing to be gained by staying. Brian nodded and released his hold. Swish. Brian went up into the air and spread the 4 wings behind him. And raised his right hand, and telekinesis lifted Professor X and Magneto up with him. Looking down at Logan on the ground. Brian's lips moved slightly, and he compressed the sound into a single thread. "Logan. We'll meet again. And I hope you'll still put the claws out when we do. I find the sound of them breaking very relaxing." The words arrived in Logan's ear alone. Logan looked up at him, and Brian had already beaten his wings and gone. "Homelander. Brian. Next time, you get the claws." Logan closed his right fist and 3 bone claws shot out, and there was a great deal of fight in him. Since his ability awakened, there has been something in Logan's blood that wants a war. And having been beaten by Brian, Logan very much wants to meet him again, and settle it on his own terms. "Logan. Telephone." George's voice again, and George had no idea what had just happened outside. Because Professor X had altered his memory before leaving. Logan went over and picked up the receiver. "James. Brother. Your holiday's over." A rough voice on the line. "Victor, I've barely started it." Logan frowned and said it with some feeling. "James, your ability shouldn't be wasted on a holiday. America and the Soviets are about to go to war, and the military's recalling everyone on leave. James, my mutant brother. We have a job." On the other end of the line was Logan's half-brother. Sabretooth. "Victor. What job?" Logan asked it, frowning. "We're being sent to the Florida Straits. Off Cuba." Which made Logan swear. Christ. The Florida Straits are a powder keg right now. The Soviet Navy and ours are both massed there, and it could go off at any moment. It's the most dangerous place on Earth. And on the line, Victor's voice filled with excitement. "James. The most dangerous place is exactly where we belong. War means killing. And we were made to kill." And having said it, Victor hung up. Logan took 2 more pulls on the cigar, put it out in his own palm, and walked out of the Eller Tavern. New York. Xavier Manor. Brian and the other 2 had gone to recruit Logan. And Mystique, Raven, had left the manor as well. She is getting steadily better at using her ability. Which lets her walk into the White House in Washington regularly without anybody noticing anything at all. Raven goes where she likes. Never mind the White House. Raven can come and go from America's nuclear installations at will. Which left Xavier Manor to the X-Men's newest members. Angel. Banshee. Havoc. 3 young people, and nothing more. All 4 founders were out. Hank, unwilling to look at himself since becoming Beast, had locked himself in his laboratory and rarely came out. And Father Asa, who joined earlier, is middle-aged. He is also a devout follower of Apocalypse. And has no interest in entertaining a group of young gods. Which left nobody at all to keep order. So the young mutants let themselves go entirely. At present, in one of the manor's lounges. The young mutants had a party running. So, Banshee. What can you actually do? Angel, holding a glass of red wine, was dancing for the X-Men's boys, to considerable appreciation from both of them. Then Angel wiped her forehead, sat down on the sofa, and looked over at Sean Cassidy with interest, while the boys called for an encore. At the question, Sean stood up. And put his glass on the table. You'd better cover your ears. He glanced at Angel, and at the rather quiet Havoc, shrugged, and gave them the warning. Angel and Alex looked at each other, then covered their ears. Sean Cassidy drew a deep breath, opened his mouth, and screamed. The sound shook the air into visible rings. Crash. The glass on the table shattered outright. And the wine in it ran across the floor. Past the glass, the sound carried on and took out the floor-to-ceiling window of the lounge. That's fantastic. Angel's eyes lit up and she said so. Alex was impressed as well. What about you, Angel? Why does Professor X call you Angel? Having finished, Sean gave Alex a provoking look, then turned to Angel, smiling. Because I am an angel. Angel showed no embarrassment whatsoever. She stood, and the insect wings that sit across her back like a tattoo slowly opened. Buzz. They beat rapidly, and Angel lifted off the floor. Bloody hell, you can fly. Your ability is remarkable. Sean's eyes went wide. And filled with envy. Flying isn't all I can do. Angel looked thoroughly pleased with herself. She flew a circuit of the lounge, out through the broken window, and over to a bronze statue. Angel spat acid at it. And the statue's head corroded away on the spot. Watching it, Sean whistled. And Alex frowned slightly. Corrosive as the acid is, it is also somewhat disgusting. What about you, Alex? We've both shown ours. Your turn. Angel and Sean both looked at him. Alex knows perfectly well that his ability is dangerous. He is also a young man. And under enough encouragement from the two of them, Alex stood up. Mine's dangerous. I need open ground. He said it and went outside. He glanced at a statue in front of him, closed his fists, and released. Red rings of energy formed across his body. He swung both arms, and the rings came off him. Boom. 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 One ring hit the statue and split it in two. The rest went into the lawn and the ground and detonated. And one of them went straight at the building in front of him. Oh no. The color went out of Alex's face. He knew he was in trouble. If that ring hit the building, Professor X might well throw him out of the X-Men. He had only just found his own kind. He didn't want to leave yet. And anxious as Alex was, there was nothing he could do. He can release energy shockwaves. He cannot control them. And just as the ring was about to hit the manor, an enormous cloud of red mist formed in front of it. And out of the mist, several figures holding hands came into Alex's view. Get out of the way. Looking at the strangers who had appeared from nowhere, Alex shouted it in real alarm. He had no idea that the people arriving in red mist were the enemy. He was worried about their safety, and afraid he was about to kill someone by accident. When exactly is this new generation going to grow up? The mist cleared, and Shaw, wearing the telepathy-blocking helmet, looked at the incoming ring and simply put out a hand. The red ring was absorbed into him. Having taken Alex's energy shockwave, Shaw let go of Azazel's hand. He turned his head to the middle-aged woman beside him. Julie. Find Professor X. At the order, the woman called Julie moved her ears slightly. A ring of visible ripples spread out from them and swept across New York in an instant. Voices beyond counting poured into Julie's ears like a tsunami. The pain of it filled her face, and then she caught Professor X's voice, in the Eller Tavern. Black King. Professor X, Magneto, and Brian are all at the Eller Tavern. 49 kilometers from here. Julie said it, pale. Well done, Julie. Now I can finally take this wretched helmet off. Shaw patted her shoulder, then removed the helmet with visible distaste. Before leaving to recruit Logan, Brian had told Azazel where the X-Men were based. And Azazel had passed Xavier Manor to Shaw on returning to the Hellfire Club. Azazel also told Shaw that the X-Men were recruiting, which made Shaw considerably more afraid of them. So once he knew Xavier Manor existed, he used Azazel's ability to teleport straight there. And, given the lesson Brian taught him last time, and to avoid a second failure, almost the whole Hellfire Club came. Almost. Because before deciding on Xavier Manor, Shaw had already sent the White Queen to the Soviet Union. Emma aside, every member of the Hellfire Club was present. Shaw, Azazel, Ursa Major, the Soviet Union's first mutant, newly recruited, and Julie, the ear. But having arrived at Xavier Manor and seen Alex and the others, Shaw was disappointed. He had intended to catch the X-Men completely unprepared, and had worn that ugly helmet specifically for it. And it turned out the X-Men's 4 founders weren't there at all. There was nothing in the entire base but small fry. Looking at Alex and the others, Shaw could not summon any enthusiasm for a fight. Good afternoon, fellow mutants. I'm Sebastian Shaw. Relax. I'm not going to hurt you. Shaw changed tack. Looking at the confused faces of the young X-Men, he decided to cut the ground out from under them and take these mutants for the Hellfire Club directly. A gentle smile arrived on Shaw's face, and he walked toward Angel and the others. Roar. And just as Shaw was about to extend the Hellfire Club's olive branch to them, a roar came out of the manor. A blue shape came at Alex fast. Get back, Alex. A low, heavy voice arrived in Alex's ear. Alex turned toward it, and saw a blue-furred gorilla 2.5 meters tall, packed with muscle. Beast. Hank had left his laboratory the moment the explosion started. And seeing Shaw, his pupils contracted hard. But the Hank who became Beast has left his timidity behind. Faced with an enemy well beyond him, Beast still shows his claws. Shaw. Get out of Xavier Manor. Beast's fur stood up across his whole body, and he roared it. So the X-Men do have some talent after all. Shaw looked over Beast's frame with interest, and something like appreciation. A pity. I already have a Beast on my team. Shaw said it with some regret, then turned to the Soviet standing beside him. Yurikovic. This one's yours. Shaw said it to Ursa Major, Ursus Yurikovic. Of course, Shaw. The 1.90 meter Ursa nodded, and walked toward Beast. Watching him come, Beast frowned slightly. He had no idea what Ursa's ability was. But the man was Hellfire Club, which made him an enemy. Who cares what he can do? Hit him first. Beast roared, closed his fist, and punched Ursa square on. Beast has very little fighting technique. But the strength in that body is enough that technique isn't required. Bang! An enormous impact. And facing the punch, Ursa didn't so much as move aside. He tore the thin vest off his body, and every part of him began to change. Under Beast's astonished eyes, Ursa became a 3.5 meter Siberian brown bear, enormous and heavily built. At 2.5 meters, Beast came up to the bear's stomach. Oh, hell! Beast bared his teeth and swore. Bang! And his fist landed. A punch capable of bending steel hit Ursa Major, and produced no reaction at all. An enormous bear's head looked down at him. Taste the strength of a Siberian brown bear. The bear was entirely without mercy, and swatted Beast away with one paw. Boom! Beast went straight into the lounge behind Alex and the others. The wall came down and buried him. Bear strength. Ursa Major walked over to the rubble. Took hold of Beast's right foot, and dragged him out. And through Beast's furious roaring. Ursa Major raised an enormous paw and slammed him back into the ground. The force of it shattered and collapsed the earth underneath. And where Beast lay, there was an enormous paw print in the ground. Cough. Beast's resilience is remarkable, and it was not enough against a bear. His sternum caved in and blood came out of his mouth. One blow, and Beast was gravely injured and close to finished. Ursa Major simply hard counters him. Right. The one in the way is dealt with. Now. My fellow mutants. The revolution is about to begin. Shaw glanced coldly at Beast lying to one side, and his face turned gentle again. He walked up to Angel, Sean Cassidy and Alex, and offered them the Hellfire Club. When humans find out about us, we will all face a choice. Will mutants be enslaved by humans? Or will mutants rule over them instead? All of it comes down to what you choose. You can stay where you are and keep fighting to protect humans who hate you. Or join us, become a member of the Hellfire Club, and take command of your own life. You could be a king. And saying it, Shaw looked at Angel. Or a queen. At which Angel was genuinely moved. In the human world she was a stripper. And if she joined the Hellfire Club, she might really become its queen, exactly as Shaw said. Angel looked around at all of them. And then took a step toward Shaw. No, Angel, you're turning on us. Sean Cassidy said it to her in flat disbelief. Shaw's right. We mutants were born to stand above them. Having said it, Angel felt no further hesitation at all. She walked to Shaw's side and took the hand he was offering. Good girl. And what's your ability? Shaw looked at her, smiling, and asked it gently. I'm Angel. I have insect wings, and I spit acid. Angel demonstrated it proudly, and entirely failed to notice his face change. How very useful. Shaw's smile noticeably faded. Still, he had recruited her now. Turning Angel away over a weak ability would only upset the rest of the Hellfire Club. So even though Angel is a level 1 mutant of the sort Shaw would once have found beneath him, Shaw had no choice but to take her. And having learned what Angel could do, Shaw stopped expecting much from Sean Cassidy or Alex either. He glanced at Angel, and his eye twitched. He was beginning to regret coming to Xavier Manor at all.
Hello everyone! As we wrap up this video, I want to share a quick note. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like to support me and enjoy on-demand audiobooks, you can become a Patreon member. Alternatively, you can check out my Google Drive link, which has 500+ novel audiobooks available through my Ko-fi or Patreon shop. I appreciate your support.